If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 45.5 Escalation. While Silco prepared and made his way toward Orion's holding cell, the last drop / Marcus storms into the last drop, flanked by 2 enforcers. The bar falls silent, its usual happy clamor replaced with tense hostility. As they walk through, glares follow them with grips tightening on mugs, weapons, and chairs. "What can I get you?" Vander greets them as if they were ordinary customers. Marcus removes his mask with a hiss, smirking confidently, "For some rats will do." He gestures to the enforcer beside him. "Search the place." Vander twitches, following the enforcer briefly while the other turns to stand guard behind Marcus. His expression tightens before shrugging, "While you're wasting your time, how about a proper drink?" "I'll take the strongest shit you've got," Marcus replies as if it was a challenge. Smirking, Vander reaches below to grab a bottle of his strongest liquor. As he does, he presses an emergency button, his silent signal for the kids to hide. The alarm monkey crashed to the floor from the shelf, and the kids scramble for the beams above. Powder, however, was struggling. The aftermath from 2 days ago had left her traumatized, the glimmer of hope that Orion would return was barely keeping her together. She hadn't been eating well, and her arms trembled as she tried to pull herself up. The ominous footsteps loomed closer, each one resonating like a drum. Powder realized she couldn't make it, and made a frantic decision. She dove under the bed, curling into herself, her breath shaky as the monkey's alarm faded into eerie silence. Sliding the drink across the bar, Vander smirks as Marcus winces after just one sniff. You be careful with that," Vander teased. Looking up, Marcus met his gaze with a smirk. "Nearly forgot. I ran into an old friend of yours. He had some interesting stories." Reaching out, he snatches Vander's pipe from the counter, prompting Vander to slam his fist against the table at the disrespect. "You weren't always the peacekeeper," Marcus sneered as Vander shook his head at the riled-up barfolk, dropping it into the liquor. The drink catches fire. The enforcer behind Marcus snarls, whipping out his baton as the others in the bar stood up. "Let her go." Six's unmistakable voice rings out from the back, full of desperation. "Vander!" Everyone froze. Silence gripped the bar, broken only by the faint screaming of kids and the low hum of bar music. Marcus's eyes widened as he stood up abruptly, sensing the mounting hostility. Vander was faster though. Gripping Marcus by the hair, Vander slammed his face into the drink, blood and liquor smearing across the table and burning Marcus's skin. Without pause, Vander followed up with a vicious hook, sending Marcus sprawling to the floor. The Undercity patrons erupted with shouts, their rage ignited as they charged the remaining enforcer. His fate would be anything but merciful. A chair flung across the room and impacted him before the onslaught began. "Leave them alive!" Vander bellowed, pointing at Marcus's struggling figure before he unclipped his hanging gauntlets and rushed to the back. "AAA!" Powder screamed in pain as the enforcer growled menacingly, ripping her out from under the bed by her hair. "Let her go!" Six shouted before she launched herself from the beams above. Her kick landed against the enforcer's shoulder, forcing him to let go as he stumbled. "Vander!" Six cried out desperately, pulling Powder away. Powder cried loudly in Six's arms as the enforcer recovered with a snarl, pointing his flashlight at them while picking up his baton. Clagger and Milo both sprung into action with their own battle cries. The enforcer, now more aware, steps back to avoid their landing jump kicks. After they landed, the sounds of fighting erupted from above, snapping the enforcer's head to attention. Visibly, one could see his grip on the baton tightening, a dangerous glint appearing behind the goggles. Clagger followed up by attempting to tackle the enforcer at the waist. Without mercy or hesitation, the enforcer slams his baton against Clagger's head. Blood sprayed as Clagger let out a pained grunt before collapsing to the floor unconscious. Eyes wide with shock then rage, Milo hesitated for a split second. It was enough time for the enforcer to grab him by the neck, slam him against the bunk bed once, twice, and a third time in quick succession until Milo lost consciousness. Six had let go of Powder when the enforcer grabbed Milo, crying out, "No!" But the enforcer's actions were so brutal and swift, tossing Milo's limp body across the table, its contents noisily clattering out, that she had to face him head-on. Six's eyes burned with fury as she charged the enforcer, fists raised. The enforcer raised his baton as if he was going to swing, prompting Six to hunch in preparation to dodge, her focus on the weapon. Seeing Six fall for it, the enforcer sent a strong kick toward her navel. Spittle flew out as Six collapsed with painful wheezing, tears blurring her vision. Powder curled up against the wall, sobbing as the enforcer approached her. Clutching her head, she whimpered through her tears, "Six. Milo. Clagger." As the enforcer loomed over Powder, reaching for her, the door burst open with a deafening slam. Vander snarls as he charged through, his gauntlet slamming into the enforcer's face. The impact shattered the enforcer's mask, sending shards of glass flying. A gurgled cry escaped the enforcer as the jagged shards blinded and tore into his face. Powder shut her eyes tightly, clasping her hands over her ears, trying desperately to block out the gruesome sounds of what followed. Wet, brutal noises of flesh and bone breaking. When she finally opened her eyes, Vander was standing over her. His eyes, full of grief and realization, met hers knowing what she was about to see. A bloodied corpse next to her, Milo and Clagger were unconscious and bleeding, and Six sobbed as she clutched her stomach in pain on the floor. Vander trembled, feeling completely helpless in this situation. His voice dropped to a hushed whisper, heavy with guilt, as the gauntlet slid off. "I'm sorry, Powder." He turned away, Vander's heart breaking as he moved to attend the others. Chapter 45.6, Silco's Opportunity, Short. The use of human corpses for science and profit was viewed as highly immoral by the general populace. On this basis, it was made illegal and punishable by execution to do so. There was value in the human corpse, however, and scarcity increased its value too. The human body has many uses. Elites seek them for transplants or usage in medical research. The Undercity sought them for alchemical components. Some seek human components for cultural or spiritual purposes, consuming vitality or believing that a soul can be absorbed to extend life, others for art. For Piltover, the city of progress and a trade hub, renowned for its unusually fast advances that surpassed those of many other nations, a black market for human corpses existed. House Kiraman, upright and noble, was barred from this knowledge and entry. Silco, however, knew this world too well. He used it to keep his corrupted eye stabilized. Strangely enough, he also despised the practice mainly because it was built on the suffering of Undercity residents. Topsider corpses were rarely involved, but if they were, a high price was paid. Quality over quantity. What elite would want to use low-quality goods for their purposes? If you were in good health while living in the Undercity, you may be killed for that very reason. Silco used this system, but paid a high price. The alchemical components he purchased from human corpses came from Topsiders only, as if to justify his usage of it. Coroners and medical personnel were sectioned off into two divisions inside Piltover. Topsider personnel for privileged Topsiders, and the other for Undercity residents. As one could expect, the quality of everything was much lower for those of the Undercity. From pay to housing to medical treatment. Paperwork standards and security were also more lax. One would think this was illogical, and it was. But in truth, this was deliberate disparity created as an opportunity for exploitation. Corruption here was not a flaw, but a purposeful hole to funnel money through. Orion was an Undercity resident, so he received care from Undercity medical personnel. While there were many altruistic souls in the field, envy and troubles still existed. The medical personnel were paid so little by the Piltover government that they often had to take on second jobs or accept certain deals off the books. Many of them lived in the Undercity too. When the medical personnel in charge of Orion's care received expensive ointments and elixirs from House Kiraman, there was envy. Why was Orion receiving this treatment? He tried to save kids but was still being put on trial? If it was them, they wouldn't receive this treatment, and it was true. Many had lost friends and co-workers and were lucky if they received silver or two to cover funeral costs. Upon hearing Orion being caught up in the explosion, Silco began asking around. It didn't take long, but it took larger sums of money, and threats, to discover what he needed. Silco would have the medical personnel alter Orion's health records to show sudden deterioration and death. Silver and the lives of their loved ones were their rewards. Pay off the Undercity coroner, who was deeply involved in corpse selling, to sign off. Silco's group would be the contracted party to dispose of the body. Silco knew questions would be asked quickly after, with Grayson leading it. He respected her, she was intelligent, but also a threat. Silco, however, wasn't planning on hiding anymore. With the help of a scientist, they developed Shimmer. There was a plan. Orion, to Silco, was either a martyr or a symbol. The story had already spread far and wide, to some degree with Silco's influence. A boy from the Undercity trying to save Undercity children from a terrible decision. Despite trying to save the kids, the topsiders still intended to put him on trial as an example. What better way to rally the masses to his side than to save Orion? There was also the undeniable fact that Orion was previously connected to the Kiraman household. His existence alone created a powerful opportunity for leverage and corruption. Smirking as he handed over false papers and silver to the guards outside of Orion's cell, Silco felt eager to claim his prize. Chapter 46, Underneath the Surface. What do you mean he's dead? Grayson angrily slammed the desk. She had just returned from the council. She was overwhelmed with the council's demands and the fallout. On top of that, she received regular updates from the Undercity that delayed her movements. It was sudden, the sergeant began nervously. He stood at the position of attention, flanked by 2 enforcers, with more stationed at the exit. Sweat dripped down from his forehead. The guards reported it immediately. We sent 2 runners to inform you, but they never reached you. Sighing in frustration, Grayson rubbed her forehead. It was somewhat understandable given her constant movement, but the situation felt strange. Order those runners to be brought in for questioning, Grayson growled, glaring at the sergeant who nodded sharply. And show me the body. The sergeant stiffened, visibly panicking. He realized he had messed up badly and dreaded his next words. The coroner already signed off on the paperwork. The body is being transported to the Undercity for burial. Slamming the desk again, Grayson bellowed, What? This is a high-profile case. Get the coroner in here, now. He will stand behind bars within the hour. One of the enforcers immediately ran out. And you such incompetence. Grayson jabbed a finger in his face. Turn in your badge immediately. You're off the force. Grayson understood that this was normal for Undercity practitioners and death cases, but this was unacceptable given the circumstances. The sergeant paled. Realizing he was about to lose his main source of income, he broke from the position of attention and raised his hands in protest. But Sheriff, this is my first offense. I've served diligently for over 5 years without a single mistake. Yes, and now that spotless record is gone because of this mistake. Mistake? You don't seem to realize the severity of this fuck-up. Grayson scowled. She called past him, Enforcers, take him away. Wait, please. Let me make amends. The ex-sergeant cried out as he was dragged from the office. After he was removed and the sounds of struggle faded, Grayson let out another frustrated sigh. She sat back down. Send a runner, order them to return the body. At the very least, the boy should be buried somewhere decent. Sheriff. An enforcer sprinted into the office, panting heavily. Riots have broken out across the Undercity. Grayson stood up abruptly, alarmed. What caused it? Marcus entered the last drop with some enforcers and started a fight, the enforcer reported. Grayson's eyes widened in horror as he continued. Undercity residents were injured, kids too. They are holding him hostage. Leaving her desk, Grayson strode past the reporting enforcer, shouting orders as she moved. Have every lieutenant and sergeant report to me immediately. Put every enforcer on high alert and send reinforcements to the bridges now. What a strange body. A curious voice rang in Orion's ears as he started to regain consciousness. These scars are highly unusual. Orion felt a needle pierce his arm, followed by a knife cutting into one of his scars to peel away samples. His body spasmed in pain, a shout escaping him before he faded away again. Remarkable. An astonished voice cried out as he briefly regained consciousness. These wounds. He faded out once more. Silco's low voice slithered into his ears. Will he survive? Yes, given time, an older, raspy voice replied. Orion's head rolled around as he slowly opened his eyes. He was in the observatory, the eerie depths of the sea visible through a nearby window. With a smirk, Silco taunted him from a velvet chair, back from the dead. Coughing, Orion's body ached as he laid on a metal table, new pains added to the old. The time for secrets is over, Orion. Silco said with a cold gaze. Orion blinked at Silco, then at the unfamiliar man stepping into view. He blinked again, it was Singed, or Corin Rivek, before his injuries from the explosion. Singed frowned as Orion's expression betrayed his recognition. Silco hummed in amusement, oh? Unexpected. Sighing, Singed closing his eyes as though disinterested in Orion's apparent familiarity. His interest was elsewhere. Your previous wounds I took a sample out of curiosity, Singed said. I hope you don't mind. What? Orion croaked, glancing down to see fresh patches on his shoulder, side, leg, and 2 other spots that were never injured previously. Coughing through gritted teeth, Orion glared at Singed. Why the fuck wouldn't you ask first? Of course, I mind. Consider it payment, then, Singed chuckled softly with a lack of empathy. I'll be overseeing your recovery. His voice trailed off as he turned his attention to a lit-up dish plate before looking back at Orion. Silco remained silent, his crimson gaze fixed on Orion with growing intrigue as he leaned forward. You were receiving special treatment. Elixirs, correct? Singed asked. Orion stiffened uneasily at the question, his mind flickering to the fresh patches on his old scars that had been previously healed with magic. Orion nodded slowly. As I thought, Singed grunted in satisfaction. Unfortunately for you, however, I discovered your secret. You're capable of using magic, aren't you? Orion didn't answer, at a loss for words. Singed eyed him and grunted, taking his silence as acknowledgement before turning away. Silco's eyes widened with shock, his posture straightening as he stared at Orion. Apparently, Singed decided to wait to reveal it. A mage in the Undercity. Silco said in disbelief, running a hand through his hair. He paused, his gaze hardening as it fixed on Singed. How do you know? Singed, who had walked back to the dish, spoke with a mixture of fascination and envy in his tone. I theorized mages have unique body compositions, altered through the use of magic. Their bodies are more resilient, their tissues more regenerative. It's an extraordinary alchemical quality, one I've dreamed of replicating. He turned back to Orion. Your existence proves my theory true. The manipulation of magic leaves an imprint. So what? Orion groaned, disliking where this conversation was headed. You want to cut me up and use me for your experiments? Not precisely. Singed replied, his gaze studying Orion intently. It felt unnerving, as if he was a live experiment being observed. A mage in Zon, Silco mused, running a finger over his corrupted skin. What the council wouldn't give to see you banished or destroyed. Congratulations, Orion. You're moving up in the world. He chuckled mockingly toward the end. Orion sighed, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. What type of magic are you capable of? Singed asked with curiosity. A moment of silence followed. Wait, Orion thought, he has a daughter. When he turned his head back to Singed and Silco, it was quite a sight. Singed's eager, expectant expression and Silco's wide-eyed intrigue bore into him. There was no coming back from what he would say. Many types, Orion said reluctantly, his voice low. Including healing magic. Chapter 47, Dear Friend Across the River. The room fell into tense silence. Singed's eyes flared wide, his hand extending toward Orion as if examining a rare artifact. The sheer intensity made Orion's skin crawl. Silco broke the quiet, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Healing magic? Your current state is such compelling proof. Silco exclaimed, his expression full of doubt. Irritation flickered across Orion's face as he replied, there's a cost to it for me. I didn't want it discovered and I needed more time. His voice was steady, but a bitter edge lingered. You're safe enough now. Show us, Singed said eagerly, his fascination evident as he leaned forward, disregarding Silco's menacing glare. Silco's gaze returned to Orion, nodding. It isn't a request, is it? If I don't. Orion's thoughts trailed off grimly. Do you have food? Orion said, his voice tight. I told you, it comes with a cost. I'm already starving, Orion added. Silco tilted his head toward the stairs and nodded silently. Though Orion couldn't see whom he was signaling, the message was clear enough. Singed touched his chin, his brows furrowing. Ah! The magic draws from your vitality. Fascinating. When Orion nodded in response, Singed's fingers began tapping his chin with growing excitement. Such traits, rare, even amongst mages. Theories suggest it only happens when the magic itself is too potent. Or perhaps when the wielder lacks control. Orion hesitated, his gaze dropping down to his wounds. He had already decided the order of healing back in the piled-over jail: his abdomen, leg, side, and finally any smaller lacerations. The problem was the company. Silco's voice cut through Orion's hesitation, low and taunting. Don't be afraid, Silco remarked with a knowing smirk. You've already come this far. Don't let fear drag you back to weakness. Protests and riots erupted after news of the last drop incident broke, the news spreading like wildfire. Enforcers were forced to evacuate as furious residents actively hunted them down, seeking vengeance for their brutality. Tensions had already been simmering for some time, barely kept in check by the enforcers' heavy-handed tactics. But now, that was gone. Along the main road, enforcers set up a perimeter, retreating street by street, withdrawing their forces as the riots intensified. Residents from every corner began joining the uprising, seizing the opportunity to fight back. At first, it was viewed as minor unrest, some isolated groups causing trouble, manageable for the enforcers. But deep into the evening, the unrest grew uncontrollable. On the Progress Bridge, enforcers stood in formation, their rifles drawn with grim anticipation of further escalation. Triumphant cheers erupted as the enforcers were finally forced from the entresol level. People were celebrating arm in arm, the second taste of victory in their lifetimes since the previous rebellion. Vander and Benzo remained unseen at first. But when they finally emerged, gauntlets soaked in blood, they led the downtrodden and forgotten from both Sump and Entresol with grim determination. Echoes of old chants rose from the crowd. Oh, do not despair, children of the underground! For the old hound has taken up his claws once more. And with a vengeance, he will cull the arrogant sheep once more. Vander, stop this! Before more lives are lost. All activities between the two sides of the river were suspended. No trade, no travel for work, nothing. Ships awaiting passage through the canal were on standby, their crews guarding the vessels in case rioters attempted to take advantage of the chaos. Under the harsh glare of floodlights on Progress Bridge, enforcers stood with guns drawn behind professionally built barricades and reinforced weaponry. Opposite them, an angry mob pressed against makeshift defenses of wood and metal sheets, shouting and raging with defiant fury. Vander and Grayson stood face to face, their expressions dark and tense. Neither yielded. Neither blinked. The weight of this standoff, the consequences, hung heavy between them. Vander's gaze flicked past Grayson, taking in the more professional soldiers lined behind her, before returning to meet Grayson's gaze. You should train your boys better, Vander said, restraining his anger behind a low voice. Marcus will be behind bars, Grayson negotiated, gesturing to the mob behind him. The lockdown ends. No more barricades. We'll put out warrants instead and handle this the right way. It sounds too good to be true, Vander answered skeptically. Does the council know of this? Grayson shook her head. No. Not yet. Then your word means nothing, Vander replied. Sighing, he extended his gauntlet fist with an upward gesture. I understand your good nature, Grayson. Trust me, I didn't want this either. His gaze hardened, voice tightening. But we both know this falls on the council. Then give me time, Vander, Grayson pleaded, her gaze softening. At least until tomorrow evening, so we can talk this out on both sides. I doubt many on your side truly want to die. Vander growled, plenty are willing to sacrifice themselves for what topside has done. Was last time not enough proof? Falling silent, Grayson could only shake her head in reluctant acknowledgement. An agreement seemed close when Vander broke the quiet with a sharp demand. Return Orion to us as well, Vander said firmly. Grayson froze, hesitating as her gaze returned to Vander's glare. He did nothing wrong. Everyone knows that. A long pause followed. Grayson's expression wavered, hesitance, grief, frustration swirling as she spoke. Orion's dead, Vander. The words seemed to knock the breath from him, his face falling as grief took hold. What am I going to tell this kids? The thought echoed in his mind. Or at least, that's what the paperwork says. Grayson's voice contradicted itself with uncertainty. Vander gritted his teeth, head snapping up at Grayson as his gauntlets trembled at his sides. Show me the body. Grayson shook her head. The body crossed the river already. It shouldn't have processed so quickly. She hesitated, glancing away. Are you suggesting foul play? She shook her head with uncertainty, neither acknowledging or denying it. I'll show you the papers. Vander, I cared for him too. He was a good kid. Chapter 48, A spark rekindled. An enforcer rushed forward, presenting a copied scripture of the transfer papers. This symbol. Vander's eyes went wide after Grayson handed him the papers. A circled V, his old symbol of leadership, one he hadn't seen in years. Grayson's brows furrow, watching him closely. Your old symbol of leadership. The last time we crossed this bridge, this was our symbol. Vander growled. His grip tightened, crumpling the papers as he read it. His eyes snapped back to Grayson with a dangerous glint. Give me time to look into this. I might have the people responsible ready for you to lock up. Grayson nodded, her gaze flickering between him and the paper. Marcus. We're keeping him until this is resolved, Vander interrupted firmly, turning away. He'll live. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. After Vander turned, Grayson did the same, sighing under her breath. There was nothing more to say. All Grayson could do, outside of calming and stalling the council, and reinforcing their defenses, was hope that Vander could uncover the truth behind this situation or pacify his people. When Vander arrived at the morgue inside the riverside cemetery of Promenade with Benzo and a few loyal patrons from the last drop, they moved with intense purpose. The Hound? Wait. The morgue's assistant stammered, his voice cracking as Benzo lifted him by the scruff of his collar. Wordlessly, Vander unfurled the documents, shoving them so close to the man's face that his breath fogged the page. The assistant's eyes darted between Vander's stern gaze and the crumpled papers, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning fear. Ah, this symbol Silco. When the assistant sputtered out Silco's name, Vander snarled. Where is he? The other side of the bridge, further north. The abandoned seafood factory. He's expecting you. The assistant's words tumbled out in a panic as Benzo's grip tightened. Vander's gaze sharpened, letting the man choke and struggle a moment longer before nodding to Benzo. Let's go. Benzo's eyes narrowed, voice cold. About time. I've wanted to snap that rat's neck for a while. He drops the assistant to the ground, who is left sputtering and holding his neck with relief. As the group turned back toward the bridge, a small figure hidden between the shadows of the tombstones scurried off unnoticed. / the last drop, late into the night / I call dibs on the bat. Clagger declared, smirking at Milo's outrage. No, I found it. Milo shot back, crossing his arms. But I called it. I found it. Respect the dibs. Clagger and Milo continued bickering over the array of gimmicks laid out. Despite their bandaged and stitched up wounds from the previous fight, both were eager for payback. So was Six. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on her legs, brows furrowed in tense thought. Shame weighed heavily on her. She felt like she had failed to protect everyone. That wasn't going to happen again. Her fingers traced the brass knuckles Orion had given her for her birthday. Her eyes closed briefly, bitter with regret, before she stood up, her expression hardening with renewed determination. Powder peered over at Six from their bed. She was busy fiddling with her explosives and gadgets. This time, she felt certain that her creations would work. They just had to work. Clink clink clink. Soft, high-pitched noises drew Powder's attention to her brown pouch. 3 glowing, unstabilized hextech crystals shimmered within. Before the violence inside the last drop, Six and Powder had sat on the rooftop together. Powder had shown her the crystals then, but neither connected them to the massive explosion. Six told her to keep it a secret from Vander, a secret between them, just like Orion. This led to multiple chases and a confrontation inside the last drop, where Vander was publicly accused of being weak in front of the kids, causing many patrons to storm out in disgust. This was before the fight with enforcers began. Six, are we going or what? Milo called, bitterly giving up on the bat and settling on his lock-picking kit. Clagger was also looking at Six while resting the bat against his shoulder. He smirked one last time at Milo, who scowled, before they both looked to Six again, waiting for her response. Clagger's demeanor had shifted too. Before I would have said we shouldn't go against Vander, but I want some payback. Clagger tapped his bandaged head. I don't want to sit around and do nothing. I guess the enforcers finally did something right for once, Milo grumbled, rubbing his own bandaged head, still sore from the repeated slamming. Suddenly, the door burst open. All eyes snapped to the entry. Echo ran in, panting, eyes lit up with excitement. Spotting Clagger first, he waved. Hey Clagger! Clagger chuckled softly, hey, little man. What are you doing here? I was following the crowd when Vander, Benzo, and some others from the bar left the bridge. Echo bounced on his heels with excitement. They left the bridge for Riverside Cemetery. The group exchanged confused glances. Echo paused, clearly waiting for a bigger reaction. And? Clagger asked, raising a brow. Oh. Yet. Echo blinked before speaking faster, eyes wide as he was continually unable to contain his excitement. I was close enough cause it was dark and quiet, so I was all stealthy and sneaky. He exaggerated some tiptoeing motions. Anyway. They're looking for someone. Who? Six asked, frowning. Who's so important that they'd leave the bridge? I don't know, Echo responded quickly. But they were pissed. Benzo sounded ready to kill someone. I heard the guy they were strangling mention an abandoned seafood factory, the one on the north side of the bridge. Six exchanged tense glances with Clagger and Milo. Why would they go all the way out there? Milo muttered, gripping his lockpick tighter. Clagger shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know. But if Benzo's that mad, then something bad is happening. You're right. If Vander's going that far, it's serious. We should be there. Six exclaimed, nodding. Her grip on the brass knuckles tightened. I'm not sitting this out. Vander said we should stick together, so we will. No matter what. Powder spoke up from the bed, uncertainty in her voice as it drew everyone's attention. But Six. What if we make things worse? She traced her creations with her fingertips as her emotions leaked out. What if someone gets hurt? Like before. Powder didn't need to say more, everyone knew who she meant, as well as their own injuries. Six knelt down in front of Powder, gently resting her hands on her shoulders. We aren't running in blind this time, Powder. If Vander and Benzo are walking into danger, then we need to have their backs. Right. Powder hesitated before nodding. A cheer from Echo echoed through the room as he jumped in place. I'm coming too, right? As long as you stick close to Powder, Six nodded. If it gets too dangerous, you two run. After speaking, Six walked over to the gimmicks, retrieving a smoke flare, and handed it to Powder. Use this, and we'll find you. I promise. Clagger chuckled with his excitement starting to bubble too, hitting the bat against his open palm a few times. Let's do this. Yeah, Milo cheered, raising his lockpick in the air with a grin. Six smiled at the group, their infectious energy spreading as confidence reignited in the room. For the first time in a while, they felt like a team again, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 49, What Remains? Silco. Vander growled as they approached the entrance. The once abandoned seafood factory was now a shimmer chemical factory. The factory doors were wide open, revealing the abominable creations behind it. Vats of purple liquid, chemicals glowing and dripping into glass vials, and stockpiles in crates ready for distribution. Silco walked out with over 24 thugs, each armed and standing in formation behind him. Among them was Sevika, wielding a large, jagged blade. She had once been Vander's most trusted a bouncer and enforcer when he fought for a better Undercity. She had believed in his vision for change. But Sevika was one of the many patrons who walked out of Vander's bar after their disdain for his weakness. Now, she snarled, her grip tightening on the blade. Why? Sevika? Vander asked, voice laced with hurt. His expression darkened as he frowned. Sevika spat on the ground between them. You'll turn your back on us. I saw it then, and you're proving it now. That was all Vander needed to piece it together, despite Silco's commanding gesture to silence her. Orion's not dead, is he? Vander's sharp gaze locked onto Silco, who gave a subtle nod. Visible relief passed through Vander, his shoulders easing slightly. Vander dropped one of his gauntlets with a loud clang, extending a hand toward Silco. Silco, we can end this. Now. Before more people die. Unbelievable, Silco's cold tone cuts through the tension. He sneered, words unable to hold all of the disgust within him. Is that all it takes? A glimpse of hope and you're begging for peace. Sevika snarled, stepping forward. Silco's right. This is pathetic. How long should we cower, Vander? We have the weapons to beat them now. Benzo, silently observing the factory's contents behind them, shifted with growing unease. What is all of this? Shimmer, Silco said, pride staining his words. He paced slowly between his men, fingers tracing his corrupted skin with a dark smile. Topsiders see us as filth. Monsters they'd rather erase. But there's a monster in all of us, Vander. Even them. The difference? We've stopped pretending we can be anything else. You're wrong, Silco. Look at Orion, he's proof we don't have to be monsters. Vander argued, his jaw tightening as desperation crept into his voice. He's risked his life not just for us, or the kids but for everyone. And people listened. His actions sent a message to the topside ears and all of Piltover. We can be better than this. Silco continued to pace, his crimson eye resting on Vander. Contemplation crossed his face as he briefly looked down before back again. His voice softened, almost pitying. You're wrong again, old friend. His actions were never driven by heroism. They were for survival. I won't deny it, his selfless act for those kids made me reflect. Silco nodded slightly, his voice twisting upward with unsettling positivity. Even Sevika raised an eyebrow, glancing toward him with subtle confusion. But look at where it landed him. The council knew he was innocent, yet were going to sentence him regardless. It was me who saved him. Silco's eyes narrowed, venom dripping into his voice. Where were you? Tell me, Vander, did you climb topside once to search for him? Or were you too busy hiding behind your precious piece? Vander's head dropped, saying nothing. He knew he had failed in that regard, shaking his head. Still, Vander's tone carried firm resolve. I couldn't leave immediately. The situation needed to be restrained and we needed to stick together. More than one kid could have died if. Drop the noble act. You act now because your brats were hurt. Silco snarled, rage twisting his face as spittle flew out. Be damned the others of Zon, so long as your kids were safe. I would have saved Orion if given time. Vander shouted, veins bulging in his forehead. You're twisting this, you just want to tear everything down for power. Silco's hands curled into fists, his expression unable to contain everything he felt. Exhaling sharply, he briefly closed his eyes. When they snapped open, he spoke in ominous, whispered tones. Restraint? Power. Silco spat, turning his head to Sevika and nodding once. Smirking, Sevika strode back into the factory, pulling 3 vials of shimmer from a crate. Her gaze, filled with grim determination, shifted toward the shadows. From the darkness, Deckard and his friends emerged. They looked weak and pale, stumbling out with pained groans as one vomited purple liquid. You want restraint, Vander? Let's see how restraint holds up against true power. Deckard and the kids clawed desperately at the vials of shimmer Sevika offered, their eyes glassy with desperation and madness. The moment the liquid touched their tongues, their bodies began to twist and contort grotesquely, muscles bulging as they swelled unnaturally. Eerie, sickly cries echoed from their throats, their bodies now towering and deformed. Chills rippled through Vander's group as they instinctively stepped back in fear. A dozen people on his side clenched their weapons tightly, adrenaline beginning to surge through their veins. Silco, no! What are you doing? Vander bellowed, his eyes worriedly darting between the monstrous figures. His hand slid back into his gauntlet, fists raised in a defensive stance. Benzo's eyes widened in horror, gripping his baton tightly. What in the bloody? With a casual wave of his hand, Silco whispered, teaching the cost of restraint. The deformed creatures, once kids but now overtaken by shimmered, released guttural screams and charged. Heavy, bone-breaking impacts followed by cries of pain and the sickening sound of gurgled screams echoed into the night. Then silence, an unnatural, bone-chilling silence, broken only by the faint echoes of turmoil drifting from the bridge. Gang POV. What happened here? From an alley, the gang stared out toward the front of the factory with horrified expressions. Clagger and Milo restrained Echo, who had spotted Benzo's lifeless corpse sprawled out across the dirt. He desperately clawed toward him, tears streaming down his face between muffled cries. The 2 boys looked away, unable to bear the sight themselves. Six's gaze shifted amongst over a dozen dead corpses, lingering on the 3 hideous monstrosities lying motionlessly among them. Fear gripped her chest, freezing her in place until Powder's voice broke her trance. Where's Vander? I don't see him. Powder whispered, clutching Six's waist tightly as her gaze darted around with a brave, worried look, overcoming the gore. Six's eyes widened with realization, looking from Powder back to the carnage. You're right, he's not there. Six exclaimed, her voice growing frantic as her gaze followed a glinting blood trail leading behind closed iron gates. If he's still here, he may be inside. Vander might be hurt. Crouching down, she gently held Powder's face. Powder, stay here with Echo. We'll be back. What? But Vander told us to stick together. You said it yourself. Powder protested, her shoulders tensing as the sting of hurt and mistrust pierced her feelings. Six's voice cracked, "I know what I said. Just please. I can't lose you too." Tears dripped from her face as she pressed her forehead against her sister's. "Please. 5 minutes. If we don't find him, or if he's Six trailed off," eyes closed as she prayed the thought wasn't true. Clagger, who had mustered the resolve to look back, pointed at the roof. "There. We can make our way up and in through those missing panels. We may be able to spot Vander without jumping in." "Yet," Milo nodded, still eyeing the monstrous corpses nervously. "We don't know what those things are, jumping in could be. If Vander's alive, I'm going." Six shot back with an fiery glare. "Stay if you want, stay. But I'm going." Without another word, she strode toward a pipe along the side of the factory to start her climb. Clagger and Milo exchanged uneasy glances before quickly following after her, leaving Powder to collapse beside Echo, tears pooling in her eyes with the ache of betrayal. "We're supposed to stick together. Violet." Powder sobbed but obeyed her sister's request. Echo had also collapsed to the cold pavement, drained emotionally. He clung to Powder from behind, crying openly as his haunted gaze remained locked on Benzo's corpse. Orion POV. Orion groaned and clutched his head, sitting up slowly from the metal table. Peeking out carefully, wary of a sudden migraine, he looked down at himself. His body was skeletal, devoid of any fat and with minimal muscle, most of it consumed from the overuse of his healing magic. If it was any other form of magic, he would have just been in pain, his body torn up, or exhausted. But this magic was far dangerous when overused. Still, his wounds had healed, leaving behind fresh sharp scars of skin that seemed pulled together like tightly closed curtains. Blinking, Orion noticed 2 unfamiliar patches on his torso. Forgetting the pain in his head, he snapped his gaze upward, searching the dimly lit room for Singed. He spotted him working diligently over a dish and magnifying glass. "Damn it, Singed! Ask first!" Orion snapped. Singed didn't bother to look up, too engrossed and fascinated in his study of the sample. "Food's on the table," Singed muttered flatly, not even sparing a glance back. The food was just within reach after Orion shifted uncomfortably toward the edge of the table. It didn't taste good, but he was starving could ignore the taste. The dull ache in his stomach slowly subsided, though it wasn't gone completely. "Where is everyone?" Orion asked, setting the empty bowl aside. He was still starving, looking around for more food as his stomach growled. Singed hummed with satisfaction, barely acknowledging Orion's question as he took the dish over to vials containing shimmer, still refusing to meet his gaze. "Dealing with unwanted guests," he muttered dismissively. "Unwanted?" Orion frown deepened. His eyes shot open as realization struck him, his voice breaking. "No. No, fuck." Orion scrambled from the metal table, legs shaking as they struggled to hold his frail frame. "Clothes." On the table, Singed finally glanced up, disapproval etched into his face. "I would not advise you to go up there in your current condition." But Orion was already moving, ignoring him as he forced himself to take fast, shaky steps toward the exit. No gun, no hex flashes, nothing. The worst possible outcome. His mind raced in panic. Damn it! Nothing's working out. At the very least, I can't get caught up in the explosion. Orion glanced back. Singed was watching him with amusement, chuckling softly. Fuck him. Orion thought and scowled. The sound of crying echoed through the walls as he staggered up the stairs and into the dim corridors above. Orion raised his hand, moonlight rays scattered across his vision, temporarily blinding him before his eyes could adjust. Vats of shimmer. Crates. Weaponry. The entire factory was a fortress of war. A desperate voice, sharp with pain and panic, cut through the air from above, making his head throb. Six, come on. Let's get out of here. Stop them. Silco's voice, filled with rage, shouted out directly above him. His heart dropped. Orion's gaze shot upward, the door he emerged from was directly beneath the walkway on which Vander, Six, and Silco's thugs were destined to fight. Six's cries echoed from the side farther away from him. Suddenly, a glint caught his eye. A brilliant, light blue ball shimmered through the air toward the bridge. His heart dropped as realization set in. You've got to be kidding me. With no other choice, he channeled magic to fortify himself, focused on resilience rather than raising a shield. The side of the bridge shattered, sending shards of metal flying, thankfully none striking him this time as the explosion rocked the warehouse. Panting, Orion collapsed to one knee, his vision blurring and body trembling. Even this minor use of defensive magic, which wouldn't have saved him anyway, left him on the brink of exhaustion. It was instinctive, but ineffective due to his body's condition. Ah, fuck. Orion thought, sweat dripping from his forehead. This isn't the same. Something changed. Orion's eyes shifted toward the window, watching in agonizing slow motion as two pairs of innocent eyes shifted from wide curiosity and excitement to horror. A new glint caught his attention, shifting his gaze higher. His heart plummeted as icy dread washed over him, sharp, sudden, and paralyzing. Fuck. Orion cursed loudly, raising a shaky hand as he tried to channel defensive magic. Another unstable hextech crystal was arcing straight toward him, burning brighter with every second. Six's POV. There he is, Six whispered, not bothering to look as she leapt in onto the metal walkway above ground floor. Six, wait. Hold on. Not again. Clagger and Milo exchanged worried glances, both acknowledging Six's recklessness. Still, they couldn't let her go in alone. They were a team, so they jumped in after her, the landing echoing with a soft, sharp clang on the metal grating. Six scanned ahead, then across the bridge through the gaps of the railings. No one. Only Vander, slumped, and strapped to a chair. His face was purple and bruised, blood soaking into his shirt. As they reached the corner, Six raised her fist, signaling them to halt as her instincts finally caught up. She strained her eyes but still couldn't spot anyone. Her gaze flickered uneasily to the strange, glowing purple vats of chemicals and scattered weaponry. Did they use monsters to kill everyone? Milo whispered nervously behind her. Looks like it, Clagger nodded, his shaky breath sending a chill up Six's spine. Do you think they ran for help? There were a lot of dead bodies outside. Six glanced back at them. They still were beyond the bridge from Vander's position. Both of them were on edge and tense, flinching with just Six's glance. It feels that way, doesn't it? Six whispered, uncertainty creeping in. Why else would they leave Vander here alone? The three of them exchanged glances, nodding silently one last time before moving. They crossed the bridge hastily, Milo stumbling once with a frightened whimper. Six and Clagger both paused, waiting for him to catch back up before entering Vander's iron room. Six. Vander groaned, his head lifting weakly. His gaze shifted between them, pained. How did you get in here? There are guards everywhere. Six's gaze snapped to Milo, pointing at Vander's restraints. Despite trembling, Milo's expression hardened as he pulled out his lockpicks and rushed forward. It was easy, Six said with forced confidence. We just found an open window and... Her voice trailed off as realization struck her. She and Vander locked eyes as they both understood the trap. Six, you have to get out of here before. Welcome. An ominous voice echoed with a slow clap. Silco emerged from the shadows, a dozen bloodied thugs following behind, some bearing injuries from the earlier fight. Six could see their weapons were coated with dried blood. Six felt a chill run deeper through her as her eyes locked with Silco's corrupted, crimson eye. She didn't know him, but her instincts screamed danger. Without hesitation, she began looking around for a solution and spotted Vander's iron gauntlets. Clagger, find us a way out. Six's voice was sharp and commanding. On it, Clagger nodded, beginning to scan to the exterior walls, determination keeping him together. She pocketed Orion's brass knuckles and yanked Vander's blood-stained gauntlets over her hands, strapping them on tight. I'll hold them off. Shall we play? Silco smirked, gesturing forward as the thugs advanced. Six stepped forward to meet them head-on, ignoring Vander's protests as her resolve solidified. //powder POV // While they grieved together, one of the hextech crystals slipped from Powder's satchel. Her gaze snapped to it, the crackling sound of energy and its blue shimmer finally clicking in her mind, the explosion topside and Orion's magic. Echo, we can help them. Powder gasped. She picked it back up and held it between them. What is it? Echo sniffled, still wiping tears away as he squinted to see it. Powder hesitated, clutching it closer to her chest as guilt tightened her throat. I think these caused the explosion topside. Silence fell between them, the weight of her words pounding against Powder's consciousness. Echo was starting to regain composure. We can help save Vander. His voice trembled with fresh anger. And get revenge. Powder nodded, and together, they circled wide around to the rear of the building. Neither had the strength to climb the same way Six and the others had. Echo's once innocent face was now clouded with anger. Despite this, he held Powder's hand for support as they moved. They began climbing the leftover scaffolding and wooden planks, helping each other up with quiet determination. Powder's head whipped up, the sounds of fighting suddenly echoing from above. "Hurry, Echo! They're in trouble!" Powder shouted down to Echo with urgency. She reached down, pulling him up the final ledge before they both peeked through a broken glass window. Six was on the bridge, fighting back thugs trying to cross it while wearing Vander's iron gauntlets, dripping fresh blood. After dodging a metal pipe, Six landed a brutal hook to a thug's face, the gauntlet definitely breaking teeth if not his entire jaw before flipping him over the edge. Powder gleamed proudly to Echo, "That's my sister." Echo sniffled in response, nodding, piecing together the situation. It only took a moment to notice the crimson-eyed figure glaring at Six from across the bridge, clearly the bad guy. More thugs fell as Six continued to knock them out or flip them over the edge. Powder squeaked in fear however when Six suffered a deep cut to her side. "Six!" Powder shrieked, clutching her hair. Tears streamed down Six's face, crying as she continued to fight, knocking out the thug that cut her with a sharp uppercut before stumbling backwards in pain. Suddenly, a voice rang out that Powder recognized. "Six, come on! Let's get out of here!" It was Clagger's voice, his voice carrying a clear sense of urgency. "Stop them!" The crimson-eyed man, filled with rage, shouted out. Powder's hands shook as she pulled out 2 hextech crystals, her gaze locking onto them with fresh determination. She handed one to Echo, who hesitated before nodding, his face tightening with resolve. Before she could explain her plan, Echo hurled it with a grunt through the window. "Wait!" Powder screeched, lunging forward in shock as it arched and exploded against the bridge with a deafening roar. Shouts of pain erupted. Several thugs that began charging were hurled off the bridge while others fell with pained gurgles as metal shards pierced them. The crimson-eyed man staggered back in shock as a thug beside him fell, her arm severed by the blast. Six, crying and clutching her side, stumbled into the room. Relieved voices greeted her as the iron door behind her slammed shut. Powder and Echo exchanged triumphant grins. They saved Six and the others. And now it was time to stop the man hurting their families and friends. Echo moved aside as Powder took his place, ready to deliver her own vengeance and holding it with a determined expression. Powder hurled it with everything she had through the gap, yipping as Echo caught her from behind. He steadied her so that they could both watch the crystal arc through the air, their gazes locked as they held their breaths. It was then that her gaze shifted, catching sight of subtle movement. It was Orion. He was collapsed to one knee, sweat dripping down his face as if he was in unbearable pain. Powder's eyes widened in horror as she realized her crystal was going to fall short. Orion. Chapter 50, The End is just the beginning. You'll notice this chapter is short, read the opening of A/N to know why. // Powder's POV // A brilliant white flash of light erupted as Powder watched Orion raise his hand. Her hope shattered instantly, both she and Echo covering their eyes while screaming in fear, curling into balls. The light was so intense that illuminated everything: the river, the buildings on both sides, and even the entire bridge. Explosions followed, shaking the ground as the smell of toxic fumes filled Powder's nose. She couldn't move, frozen in fear and overwhelmed. Breathing heavily, Echo clung to Powder from behind, burying his face into her clothes. Both shook uncontrollably, waiting for the blinding light and violent tremors to pass. When it finally dimmed, Powder looked up, her breath catching. Flickers of flames danced across the chemical factory, the smoke and the smell of burning chemicals filling the air. Many explosions continued to ripple through the building, leaving the walls charred and cracking. Her gaze drifted through the blown-out window. Shards of glass littered around them, but thankfully none pierced them. What caught her attention the most was a perfect, circular gap 2 meters in circumference where Orion once was. She couldn't see the crimson-eyed man either, and some of the other thugs either. The flooring where he stood above Orion was still there, only vacant of bodies. They most likely escaped. Her heart continued to sink however, shock flooding her, unable to process what she had done. "I killed him," she whispered, voice trembling and traumatized. Echo grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently. "Powder, we gotta go." "Powder." "Echo." Clagger's voice echoed from below. Milo stood beside him, their expressions tight with concern. Powder's gaze drifted toward them, unfocused. She barely registered Vander and Six in the distance, supporting each other, bloodied but alive with pained expressions. They casted worried glances toward them as they waited. Still shaking, Powder finally climbed down slowly with Echo guiding her until it was safe enough to drop. Clagger caught her as she staggered, lifting her into his arms, cradling her protectively as he turned to run. She didn't resist, she barely reacted. Echo's gaze lingered on her sympathetically. He was also unable to find words to express what had happened. What could be said? Everyone would know soon enough. Orion's POV // The brilliant flash of light blinded Orion upon contact with the unstable crystal. He was immediately engulfed in a wide sphere of twisting, curling light that seemed to fold in upon itself. Some called it wild magic, an imprint left behind that embodied the true essence of magic, unpredictable, untamed, chaotic. Others called it corrupted magic, understandable given that while its core radiated a pure, blinding white, its edges swirled with a vile mixture of purple, red, and black. Orion shouted in pain. Despite the mesmerizing beauty surrounding him, it felt as though his skin was being stripped away, flayed by the sheer energy of the arcane. His body stretched razor thin, drawn out like liquid through a straw, yet the return to his original form was an equally disturbing, violent sensation. He channeled magic for as long as possible, even if it was just a drizzle, as he hoped to outlast this phenomenon. But it wasn't enough, and his body gave out. The colors twisted tighter, the brightness overwhelming. Then, with a deafening thunderclap, the bubble around him seemed to burst, leaving only blinding white in his vision. Gasping for air, Orion's fingers clawed the ground beneath him. Unable to understand the texture, nor able to think. Everything was on fire, yet he shivered uncontrollably. His senses failed him. No sight, no smell. He only felt sick, overwhelming nausea to the point of violent vomiting into the ground below him. Was he cold? Warm? The distinctions blurred as his consciousness briefly slipped away. Chapter 68, A/N, Moving Forward. The last chapter was short due to cutting out a large summary of the events that resulted in the aftermath. Unironically, I created the entire baseline for the start of the next arc, and keeping it in would have spoiled it instead of letting Orion discover it. That is why it was cut short. To avoid spoilers. I have it saved elsewhere for reference now. Hopefully, the 3,300, new record, average is 1,000, word chapter previously evens it out for everyone. Please continue to support the creation of this FF with Power Stones. It is greatly appreciated. That is the first volume done. As you can tell, Orion is not dead. Vander, Clagger, and Milo are still alive. So is Silco and his criminal empire, though, which is being built on Shimmer. Multiple questions for readers need to be asked. Nothing is guaranteed if we go down any of these paths. When I start either today or tomorrow, I might write something completely different. But I want to know your opinions. This is a fan fiction after all. Also, being a fan fiction, I did mention the ending would be love it or hate it. Can't make everyone happy though, especially when romance kicks off. This is a general outline of how things may progress. Nothing is concrete. This story so far has changed far beyond what I originally planned, including the more sadistic ending. 2 plot choices. Wild magic has caused an anomaly. Transportation to a different land and making his way back to Piltover before the disaster of the Hex Gates. Ionia. Demacia. Nakuz. Froldjord. And the many others : This runs into other problems with the timeline still, read timeline to plot section. Or time skipping forward 7 years to match the Arcane series, waking up older and in the same spot, continuing the story of Zon and the Arcane. Plenty of people came here for this region, and we've built up quite a bit. Some changes would have to be made for future connections. Such as Singed leaving and returning after the chemical attacks on Ionia for other lore events to happen through Runeterra. Thus changing Arcane's plot a bit too. Number romance number, obviously without a time skip, every FMC is still gonna be a kid, read below. We have to be fine with that and the continued lack of romance for a while longer if we take the first route of transportation to a different land. Less important. Attempting to straighten the timeline to plot. Following Arcane plot timeline, and not League of Legends age timeline for Arcane characters only. There is no strict mention of age I could find other than Jace being 24 then 31 after Act 1 I believe. The current year is 987 and upon the explosion at Riverside. With age in parenthesis, Orion was born in 971, 16, 6 972, 15, Jinx 975, 12. If my research is correct, characters from other regions, such as other female leads, were born according to League of Legends lore: Irelia 972, 15, Talia and Ash 973, 14, Lux and Akali 977, 10. Other characters like Garen and Silas, Shen and Zed, Yin, Tryndamere, Darius and Draven etc., would be around Jace's age of 24 or older. Except for Tryndamere, he is closer to Orion's age. Yes, Jace at the age of 31 was hitting on Caitlyn at the age of 22. 9-year gap. Not unusual, seen it plenty, but there you go. Even if he had 2 kids though, he would still only break even with his child-murdering rampage. Anyway, in short, it seems Orion's just gonna be the young squeaker in the awkward middle no matter where he lands. Other than that, I'll be updating the synopsis on the front, the art and Discord should be up there too. Write in the comments any further questions, concerns, and suggestions moving forward. Everything is still being written chapter by chapter. As mentioned at the start, however, I did accidentally create new Act 2 lore, which breaks that chapter by chapter writing a little. Update: adjusted AI cover art and synopsis. Discord in description too. Chapter 51, Stranger in a Foreign Land. Short and sweet. Hopefully, got to get used to this new land and way of speaking. For Eastern characters, future plans are in the comments. ZZZT. Orion's loss of consciousness was brief, an electric jolt of arcane energy jolting him awake. Wincing in pain, he laid flat on his stomach, struggling to push himself up to all fours, breathing heavily. Forcibly, he tried bending the magic back to the pathways within him, but the effort caused only more violent offshoots of wild energy, crackling like static electricity. "You are far from home, stranger," a strange, unfamiliar voice said from nearby. "The balance within you is in turmoil, you must control it or you will die." Grunting, Orion opened his eyes. The ground beneath him was layered in delicate and thin red petals. A fragrant floral smell so pure and unpolluted that it felt like distant memories of the past. Perhaps the last time he had ever smelled anything so clean was before coming to this world. "You think I don't know that?" Orion groaned. He raised a trembling hand, crackling arcs of wild blue energy dancing between his fingers, involuntarily causing them to twitch and spasm in unpleasant ways. His gaze finally drifted upward to the figure speaking. A man in a light blue tunic stood before him with armored shoulder padding and leather armor laced with curling patterns that were unfamiliar to him. The strange man clasped his hands behind himself, scars riddling his exposed arms and face, his brown hair tied off in a man bun. His stern expression showed experience in dealing with such strange events. Intrigued, calm, but also displeased, the man crossed his arms. While he spoke, his voice held authority, yet it was also patient. "If you know, then you must act. The longer you hesitate, the more you endanger yourself and others." "I'm trying. This isn't my doing." Orion spat, another surge of unstable energy surging through his arms to his hands. With a forced glance around, Orion spotted unfamiliar, ancient buildings towering between ethereal trees in shades of white, soft pink, and crimson red. The entire place seemed dreamlike, a world away from the grim tones of the Undercity. "Where am I?" "You are on the outer reaches of the Temple of Swannon." Kneeling, the stranger's gaze was steady and piercing. "This place draws on the spirit and magic of the land. It is a place of healing and learning. But the magic you possess disrupts the balance. It fractures the order, just like it fractures you." Orion blinked, the tension in his chest growing. "You expect me to just fix it? If I knew how, I would have already." "It refuses to obey." The stranger closed his eyes, his expression tightening as he formed a hand sign, concentrating deeply. Orion, despite the sharp pain shooting through him, scowled in disbelief. This stranger approached him, lectured while he suffered, and then started doing whatever this was. Before words laced with irritation could spill out, the stranger spoke again. "It seeks to return to the land. Magic is wild, like the creatures that roam free." He opened his eyes, locking his calm gaze with Orion's, a strange sense of sympathy present there. "Let it go, stop trying to bend it to your will." Stunned, Orion's gaze shifted down. Let it go? Just the thought of it sent shivers through him, a deep-rooted fear of what would happen. Yet, what choice did he have with the magic tearing him apart from within? Closing his eyes, he hesitated one last time. The voice echoed again, calm yet insistent. Let it go. Trembling, Orion finally released it. The magic rushed out like a dam bursting. Relief struck him immediately, but fatigue followed just as fierce, washing over him like a tidal wave. Thank you, Orion panted, his gaze still lowered as he fought to steady his breath. It is only natural, the stranger responded evenly. Shen. A small, worried voice called in the distance. Why did you run off? Who is this? Before Orion could process it further, he collapsed as fatigue overwhelmed him. Orion's knees buckled, his consciousness fading as he felt the danger had finally passed. A softer voice answered, tinged with sympathy. A lost soul. / Meanwhile, back in Piltover // How did this happen? Caitlin whispered, her voice hollow. Moments ago, she had been reeling from the shock of discovering Orion's death. So many questions, now bitterly left unresolved. To her, he was one of the few she could speak to without overbearing arrogance or dismissive mockery. Her thoughts drifted to the first incident the day her parents were kidnapped and when the mystery surrounding Orion first began. Caitlin couldn't deny she had felt something for Orion, but she couldn't understand it. Caitlin's gaze drifted up to Grayson, who eyed her sympathetically. None of this makes sense. Why weren't you informed? Why were the standards so low? Corruption, Caitlin. Grayson sighed with disappointment. We tried to track the contractors down after the riots broke out, but all we found were corpses. Whoever was behind this left no loose ends. All we have is the coroner. Walking over to the window, Grayson's gaze drifted off into the distance, exhaustion evident on her features after the past few days. Slowly, she turned back to Cassandra. Cassandra was sat on the couch, hands cupped around her teacup, tense as she braced for terrible news. Grayson's expression hardened. There are connections to several noble houses. This is a disaster. How would you like to proceed? Cassandra froze, her grip tightening on her cup. Her gaze shifted to Caitlin, who met her eyes with the piercing look of a young woman demanding justice. This caused her to falter, lowering her gaze briefly before returning it to Grayson. Proceed. This will stop the Council's aggressive tactics toward the Undercity for now. I'll handle the political fallout. Comment. 32 comment. Vote. 1 left. Chapter 70, Chapter 51.1, King Cow Order, Temple of Swanian. Orion's consciousness slowly returned, greeted by the fragrance of herbs and incense. When was the last time everything felt this peaceful, he wondered, caught in the brief serenity. What's more, his bed was soft. Soft? It took a moment for realization to strike, and his eyes snapped open fully. Nothing hurt as it did before, some mild aches here and there, but deep fatigue clung to his body. What greeted him was the strange sight of a ceiling formed by intricate weavings of tree branches. His gaze drifted down to a wall where twisting trees formed a perfect barrier against the outside elements. Are you Noxian? A sharp, distrustful voice startled him. Sat nearby with her legs crossed was an older lady in her early 30s. Her black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, her sharp eyes watching him closely. She wore light green, flowing garments that seemed suited for both ceremony and combat, bearing patterns similar to those worn by the man named Shen. She held a cynical glare as her grip tightened around a weapon Orion couldn't quite identify. No, Orion started cautiously. I'm from Piltover. Where is this temple? How did you end up here? She countered, refusing to answer him. I don't know, Orion shrugged, sitting up carefully. Hey, I don't. I didn't want to come here wherever this place is. Her grip tightened on her weapon when he expressed his confusion, but after a moment of silence, she exhaled sharply with irritation and her stance softened. You're in Ionia, she finally replied. Forgive my rudeness. I am Mayam Yehomintethi, the Fist of Shadow within the King Cow Order. My name's Orion, Orion said, frowning. I've never heard of the King Cow Order. Not surprising. You are foreign. Mayam replied, shaking her head. It may not have been intentional, but your arrival caused a magical disturbance and imbalance. She gestured toward a stitched and bandaged wound on her arm. We've been dealing with it since. Before Orion could ask what she meant, a strange laugh made him flinch. He whipped his head around, blinking in confusion. At first, he thought it was a young child because of its size. But no, this was something different. A small, Furry creature darted into sight, grinning mischievously. She's getting slow in her age, the creature teased before somersaulting onto the bed with Orion, barely disturbing it. It wore dark blue and purple robes with golden trim and once again, marked with those same intricate patterns. Light brown fur poked out from the robes and oversized, blue eyes watched him playfully. A pair of large, furry ears poked out from the robe's hood, strangely they were wrapped with tufts of fur poking out. It must have been obvious, his confusion because Mayam chuckled. First time seeing a Yordle too? Mayam asked, smirking as Orion nodded stiffly. Despite their furry cute appearances, don't underestimate them. Especially this one. I'm not cute. The Yordle snapped, taking a wide martial arts stance. I'm dangerous. Unimpressed, Mayam rolls her eyes. Yes, very dangerous. Why don't you introduce yourself properly so that we can return to our duties? So boring. The Yordle pouted, straightening its robe dramatically. My name's Kenan. The one and only Heart of the Tempest. And you, young boy, have unusual magic. Our temple draws magic and spirit energy from the land and sea far and wide. Magic is unpredictable, but it also attracts more magic. Perhaps that is why you are here swept away in a storm of wild energies. Darting forward, the Yordle grabs Orion's face with both hands and dramatically says, You must help us. Then, just as suddenly, he released his grip and added flatly, because you're the cause. Chapter 52, The Heart of the Tempest. So my arrival caused a disaster, Orion muttered disheartened. Sounds about right at this point. Inhaling sharply, he slapped his thighs as if it were just another day, glancing between them with a resigned smirk. All right. Where's the problem? Kenan blinked before a wide grin broke across his face, snickering, Ha! Straight to solving the problem, I like it. Do you think this is a joke? Mayam scowled with displeasure when Orion forced a smile. Her icy cold glare rested on Orion as she stood up. The imbalance you've created disrupted nature's spirits and spawned malevolent shadow spirits. Some of our people have been wounded and may never fight again. Children were hurt too. Sighing, Orion met her gaze with subtle frustration. That's why I'm offering to help. Do you think I wanted this to happen? I believe the boy Orion is right. Kenan crossed his arms, glancing back at Mayam. If he had no control, then this may be the best he can offer to restore the balance. Mayam looked visibly conflicted, her expression tight. With a reluctant sigh, she waved them forward. If you truly wish to make amends, then follow us. No foolish games, nor reckless magic. Do you understand? Nodding, Orion began to stand, only for his legs to buckle beneath him, sending him tumbling forward. Mayam, turning just in time, moved with quick reflexes to grip his shoulders, steadying him. Or perhaps not yet. Grimacing, her tone softened as she eased him back onto the bed. Rest. I'll have the neophytes bring you food. Kenan, bouncing lightly on the bed, raised his tiny hand, my bad. I checked his body earlier. Definitely drained. Why didn't you tell me before? Mayam's eye twitched, visibly annoyed, as Kenan giggled, I forgot. Ugh. Irritated, she turned to leave without another word. As she left, Orion finally caught a proper glimpse of her weapon, a strange, elegant scythe and tucked neatly along her waist were throwing knives, or perhaps kunao, hidden within the folds of her garb. After she left, Orion sat in silence and pondered for a moment before turning toward Kenan. Did you really forget? The little Yodel shrugged with exaggerated innocence, though a mischievous twinkle in his oversized eyes said otherwise. Ah, makes sense. They don't know me, Orion thought. Tilting his head, curiosity finally got the better of him now that the tension had eased. So, what's this King Cow order business anyway? Business, hey. Kenan hopped to the edge of the bed, his little legs dangling off. I guess you could call it that. We're protectors. Guardians of balance between the material and spiritual realms. But it's not for power, it's about harmony. Guardians of balance, hey. Orion mused. What do you get out of it? Harmony. Life flowing peacefully. Orion silently listened as Kenan's oversized eyes glinted mischievously again. We try to understand and reason first. If reason doesn't work. He opened his hand, lighting suddenly crackling between his fingers into a pulsing orb of energy. Then we act. If soothing the spirit fails, we cleanse it. We defend the balance and ourselves with only the force necessary. The King Cow order never acts in aggression. Moralists and idealists. Orion thought, a frown forming. Except they're dangerous too. I don't know how much I can help right now, honestly. Orion began, his eyes drifting down to his skeletal figure. Kenan nodded understandingly, you would struggle against even the weakest shadow spirit. Don't worry, we'll give you time. Under normal circumstances, I could fight and heal. Orion started apologetically when Kenan abruptly interrupted. Heal. Kenan's ears perked up immediately, his head snapping to Orion, expression shifting to pure interest. We are in desperate need of healers. There are many injured, and Mayam's oversized eyes narrowed, focusing intently on Orion. What is the extent of your healing? Orion gestured down toward his body. It comes at a cost. I usually end up very hungry and tired afterward. But I've healed life-threatening puncture wounds and lacerations before. As he spoke, the thought of food grew in his mind. Magic seeking balance. But it's not spiritual magic? Kenan questioned, tilting his head. I don't think so. I don't see spirits, I see threads. I see countless, twisting, and Orion's eyes widened as he focused on the magic around him. Compared to Piltover, where magic flowed in a single bundled stream like a river through his consciousness, Ionia was an ocean. It was flowing in every direction, pulsing with life. And he was standing in the middle of it. Kenan's demeanor shifted instantly. He must have felt it with his expression tightening and stance becoming more guarded. Careful, Orion. His voice dropped. Power like that can be overwhelming here. We've seen those who could not control themselves, their unmeasurable power and nature was forced to restore balance. It wasn't gentle either. Hopping nimbly off the bed, Kenan's hands moved behind him as he paced thoughtfully. Do not use your magic here without Shen to oversee it. You could bring further disaster. Pausing, his tone softened, and he glanced back toward Orion. But if you seek guidance to learn how to master it and help others. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Kenan's ears twitched, voice trailing off with a knowing grin. Perhaps we can help. Orion's gaze shifted to the doorway as a nimble little girl darted inside, balancing a large serving plate of food in her hands. Hey Kenan! She exclaimed brightly. This child, not older than 10 or 11, had jet black, messy hair tied back into an uneven ponytail. Her loose-fitting clothes, deep green with gold and brown trim, were scuffed and marked with dirt, giving her a scrappy, unpolished appearance. She darted in with remarkable speed, faster than anyone Orion had ever seen in the Undercity or even Piltover. Be careful, Akali. Kenan warned her, darting forward as her gaze shifted toward Orion. The moment her eyes met Orion's, her bright smile vanished, replaced by hostility and suspicion. Her shoulders tensed, and her grip tightened on the serving plate. Kenan had darted with an outstretched hand beneath the plate, expecting her to drop it, though he refrained from touching it. Akali's sharp gaze flickered to Kenan, silently demanding answers, before she marched over to Orion without hesitation. Nice to meet you. Orion greeted her with a forced smile, trying to keep things light. What's your oof? She shoved the serving plate against his stomach, the force hard enough to knock some air from his lungs as she set it on his lap. Who are you? Chapter 52.1, Weight of the Past. Akali. This is not the King Cow way. Kenan scolded her. Akali's expression shifted to guilt as she glanced at Kenan. Reluctantly, she let go of the plate and took a step back, sucking in air as if trying to show restraint. My name is Akali Yehomentethi. Now, who are you? Yehomentethi? Mayam's daughter? Orion asked, rubbing his stomach. His eyes dropped to the bowl of delicious food on the serving plate. Ramen. Her eyebrows furrowed and she bit her bottom lip, clutching a kunao pendant with the look of a little girl recalling something painful. In name only. Forgetting about her attitude and responding instinctively, Orion picked up the chopsticks and began digging in. He didn't notice the strange looks from Akali and Kenan until after a few slurps. Finally, he paused and took notice of the awkward silence. What? I'm hungry. Orion said with noodles hanging out of his mouth. Oh, thanks for the food. Kenan sighed, shaking his head with mock exasperation while Akali stifled a giggle. The two exchanged a glance before breaking into quiet laughter together. I suppose I shouldn't act like I did with Cassandra, but I'm so damned hungry. Orion grumbled internally, slurping up the noodles still hanging out of his mouth. I'm Orion. Orion said between bites, covering his mouth for a burp. I'll be helping out for the time being. What help can an outsider provide? Akali's expression shifted from childish joy to hostility in an instant, as if she caught herself doing something she wasn't supposed to. You should leave. Strangers only cause problems. Take back those giggles then, Orion said, pointing at her with his chopsticks. I already did. Shut up. Akali stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. She shot an irritated glance at Kenan, whose renewed giggles fueled her frustration. I don't believe you, Orion teased, unable to help himself as he dug back into the food. Akali scowled and protested, her fists clenched at her sides. What can this useless kid help us with? Akali snapped at Kenan, starting to grow impatient. Kenan shrugged indifferently, clearly amused by the spectacle but watching her carefully. Nothing right now. Ha! Useless. Useless. Weak. Worthless. Akali taunted, her voice loud and exaggerated, each word emphasized as she stepped closer until her face was just inches from Orion's. Her glare burned a hole through him, expecting a reaction. Slurp. Orion continued munching on his food with an indifferent expression, though his thoughts churned. What's up with this brat? Is she just being a normal kid or, has someone been telling her this? Akali. Kenan scolded, his tone sharp but carrying patience. Akali. An angry voice echoed from the door, far colder and sharper, causing Akali's body to stiffen instantly as if struck by a bolt of lightning. A teenage girl, possibly closer to Orion's age and dressed similar to Akali, appeared at the entrance. Dark hair in a ponytail, amber eyes and a determined glint in her expression. What caught Orion's attention however was her missing right leg. The injury seemed old, yet not old enough to have fully learned how to deal with her new life. Her balance was unsteady, breathing labored, as she clearly struggled to raise here. Orion set the food down, concerned another conflict would break out near him. Faye. Akali squeaked with guilt, her hand returning to clutch her kunao pendant as if trying to find familiarity. Mayam tasked me with delivering the food. Faye's sharp glare lingered on her, her expression sharp but her anger restrained. You stole my task, now you are taunting and disrespecting our guest. Akali took a wider stance, raising her voice defensively. But he's an outsider. What if he? The King Kaowei teaches compassion and discipline, not hostility. Go, reflect on your actions. Faye scolded. It was clear she held back, her grip tightening on the clutches, causing her knuckles to whiten. Giving Orion one last defiant look, Akali's gaze dropped, her emotion and conflict clouding her expression as she muttered, Yes Faye. Without lifting her gaze to meet Faye's disapproving glare, Akali sulked past her outside. Kenan, concerned, called out, Wait! And darted after her. The things youth can get away with, Faye said with a ruefully smile, slowly making her way in, sweat beading on her forehead. Even when they ruin your life. Her gaze, spiteful and tinged with resentment, dropped to her missing leg as she struggled into a sitting position. Orion's eyes widened sympathetically, the pieces starting to fall into place. Comment. 19 comment. Vote. 1 left. Chapter 73, Chapter 52.2, Choices We Make, Short. Yeah, I know that feeling. Orion exhaled slowly, the skin around his scars tickling like bitter reminders. Half your body's mangled, and no one lifts a finger to save you except your enemies. He snorted, a wry smile curling his lips as he picked the bowl back up. By the end, my enemy felt closer than the people I was trying to protect. Was it worth it? All because I wanted to be around familiar faces. Orion contemplated as he took another mouthful, doubt gnawing at him. Maybe it would have been better to just leave. But leaving meant abandoning the faces that haunted him, the most flashes of the gang crying, his dead parents, the constant suffering of Zonites struggling to survive. Orion paused as a thought came to him. Since when did I care so much about this world? Was it worth it? Faye's voice cut through his thoughts, her own pain evident as if she'd heard his unspoken turmoil, sharing the weight of the question. Silence gnawed at the moment as the bowl in Orion's hand felt heavier. His expression tightened, trying to find an answer. The peaceful surroundings, clean air, calmness, nature surrounding him acted as temptations to stay. Who wouldn't stay as an escape from Zon's filth, abandoning it all? But it wasn't home. It wasn't his home. In a weird way, yes, Orion whispered, drawing Faye's gaze. I didn't endure pointlessly, I was trying to protect everyone. The reward never matched the pain, but I endured anyway. Fei stared at him for a moment, her hands resting on her lap, contemplating his words before whispering, "It is a shame you were born a foreigner. You would have fit in well here." "Ha! No way." Orion snorted and chuckled. Fei looked a little taken aback, but Orion continued to gesture and ask regardless, "How did that happen?" "I was protecting our people." Fei opened up a little, but her shoulders remained stiff. Perhaps because they shared the same pain, she let out some of her frustration. "Everything was going well, I would have kept everyone safe, but she showed up." "Akali." Nodding, Fei could see the bitterness and resentment building back up in her, her fists clenching on her lap. "My dreams are no more. I can never become a king cow warrior, or even an acolyte." Tears started forming in her eyes, but she tried her hardest to not let any escape. Orion's gaze rested on her lost leg, just below the knee, a sinking feeling entering his chest as he couldn't help but sympathize with this girl. If he had been a moment too early or too late in any of his situations, he may have ended up just like her or worse. Zzzt. A thought struck Orion like lightning, his eyes widening, but he dared not act yet. How powerful is my healing magic here? Excitement started to bubble up inside of him. Excitement? Orion shook his head violently, trying to quell it, or at least keep it at a simmer. He didn't even know if it would work, and he couldn't test it without Shen around. "Fei, I might be able to help you," Orion softly said, leaning forward. "Give me some time to talk with Master Shen." Chapter 53, Duty. "No, you may not." Shen answered his request to heal Fei's leg. His voice remained calm but unwavering, arms crossed with the quiet authority of his position. "Master Kennen informed me of your magic, however. Teaching is one of this temple's guiding principles, yet your presence already disrupts the balance. If left unchecked, it could cause greater harm." It was clear Shen spoke not out of charity or personal favor, but duty. Shen continued, his tone measured. "I will assist you in learning control over your abilities at the first light of dawn. Do not be late." After talking with Fei a little longer, he discovered Shen was the Eye of Twilight, the leader of the King Cow Order, and his role was observation, understanding, and impartiality, watching the stars as they called it. Kennen was the heart of the Tempest, was responsible for the core teachings of judgment and action when necessary. He served as the voice of reason, ensuring the decisions of the King Cow Order were followed and understood by all. Mei Yam, someone Fei deeply admired, was the Fist of Shadow. She represented pruning the tree, the elimination of threats when reason failed. Orion couldn't help but feel Mei Yam's teachings contradicted the rest with assassinations and killing, but apparently it was a necessary last resort to restore harmony. War isn't okay, but killing those who disrupt the balance is. Orion puzzled to himself. If killing disrupts balance, wouldn't that create more imbalance too? Or is it about stopping further creation of imbalances? Why not fight the Noxians then? Ionia was at war with Nakos. According to them, he was told there was no reason other than greed and conquest, which also went against the principles the King Cow Order stood for. Shaking his head, Orion realized he had plenty to think about when it came to their teachings. The next morning, after a brief training session and recovery, Orion wandered the temple grounds with Akali beside him. Her presence was strange, but he chose to ignore it, captivated instead by the landscape around him. The temple was located on a hill nestled between many others. Between the dense woods and hills it was extremely difficult to access for outsiders. It also had a beautiful lagoon of clean, turquoise water, surrounded by fields of beautiful flowers and purple flory lanterns to reflect off the surface and give light. This place would be worth a fortune, Orion thought as he stared out in awe. What caught him by surprise, though, was that despite Akali being Mei Yam's daughter, it was Fei whom Mei Yam hovered around, offering comfort and guidance. She let her daughter walk alongside a stranger, a foreigner who had caused a disaster, while she tended to Fei instead. Was this a punishment or teaching? Or a broken relationship? Orion thought sadly, glancing down Akali. Her gaze was troubled, fingers clutching her kunao pendant as she gazed out with jealousy and resentment. For a place focused on balance, this feels pretty unbalanced, Orion grimly noted. Was it like this before the incident? Orion asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Akali nodded, her hurt eyes meeting his briefly before dropping back down. She told you? Nodding, Orion replied, seems like you're both holding on to a lot of resentment. Doesn't feel very, balanced, does it? After raising the tension with such a statement, causing her to scowl, Orion sighed dramatically and shook his head violently. I'm not very good at this heart-to-heart stuff. But I think I could beat you in a race down to the lagoon. Orion glanced back down at her with a smirk. Her scowl shifted into confusion. What? Bending his knees slightly, as if ready to spring into action, Orion taunted her with false claims. I'm the fastest runner in the Undercity. Are you scared I'll win? You? Win? A competitive spark ignited in Akali's eyes as she took her own stance. In that state, only one way to Orion suddenly broke off into a sprint mid-sentence. A furious, hey! Shouted out from behind him. Glancing back, Orion had laughed dramatically and mockingly but was stunned to see her catching up so quickly. Ah! No! As Orion despaired, this scene caught the attention of Fei and Mei Yam. Fei's expression darkened, as if betrayed, while Mei Yam's gaze followed them emotionlessly, her face impossible to read. Over the next few months Orion trained under Shen's guidance. They would move to an open dirt patch where nothing grew, a dead zone where the spirits seemed to avoid entirely. Whenever he would draw too much magic, or accidentally incited wild magic, Shen would raise a barrier around him, containing the energy to prevent harm to the surroundings. Not once did Shen teach him offensive techniques, and each session ended with Shen leaving immediately for meditation, offering no further discussion. During this time, Orion often noticed Akali running off with Kennen. The two played tag, performing somersaults and dancing nimbly between the trees and terrain. Orion assumed Kennen was just doing this because of her wild nature disguised training while keeping her out of trouble. His so-called guides, he discovered, were just there to monitor him. The role would alternate between Akali and Fei. Akali's energy was boundless, always wanting to explore or train. Orion frequently found himself burned out around her, but he eventually realized physical activities were the only reliable way to earn her trust. Fei, however, was the opposite. She frequently questioned his progress, her curiosity bordering on interrogation. Even Mei Yam started to ask probing questions on his readiness regarding Fei's healing. It wasn't even a guarantee he could heal her, let alone approved by Master Shen. Frustration finally broke him, and he snapped. What about your real daughter? Orion bluntly asked, growing a little disgusted with her as he met her cold stare. Aren't you going to ask me questions about her? Mei Yam's expression remained unmoved, her voice calm but distant. I'm sure she's doing fine. She has plenty of mentors. Chapter 54, Broken Harmony. That wasn't. You are meddling in affairs that you don't understand, outsider. Mei Yam reproached him. I care for Akali far more than you know, even if you can't see it. You're creating one of your imbalances, Orion shot back at her, trying to use their own teachings against her. At the very least, explaining it might ease her upset. She thinks you care for Fei more than her. Mei Yam glared at him with growing impatience, her expression tightening as her hand rested on her weapon's hilt. Explaining it would make it worse. You don't understand our ways. Nope, I don't. Orion stated flatly, contempt starting to surface. Everything you are responsible for in this order, I don't understand, honestly. Sighing and shaking his head, Orion met her cold gaze with his own. You tread on thin ground, mocking our ways as we feed and teach you. Mei Yam warned, her voice low. I'm not mocking anything. I'm questioning at you. If questioning alone feels like disrespect, then maybe there's a problem. Orion scowled as he challenged her. Silence lingered. Mei Yam's wrathful gaze breaking her composure as her hands trembled. Slowly, her weapon was being drawn, a bright glint of the scythe reflecting the light. Orion's fists clenched, teeth gritting as he tucked in his chin. Silent tension crackled between them, and magic Orion had been struggling to control tempted his mind begging to be released. Zzzt. An orb of electricity crackled and flew between them as Kennen appeared mid-air. His playful demeanor was gone, replaced by a calm authority suitable for the heart of the tempest. Enough. Kennen said, his words firm but not harsh, his blue eyes narrowing on both of them. We are here to keep balance, not tear it apart. His arms outstretched between Mei Yam and Orion, signaling for them to stop. Mei Yam's nostrils flared, her face contorting with anger as she forcibly restrained herself. A sharp movement shoved her partially drawn weapon back into its place as she took a deep breath. Kennen turned toward Mei Yam first. Mei Yam, I know your intentions are honorable when are they not? Refusing to explain the storm only makes it rage longer. Akali seeks answers that you should provide. Flinching, she let out a little tisk sound as she crossed her arms, but her body clearly relaxed. When Kenan's head turned to Orion, his voice still firm but some of the tension was lost. You speak of imbalance, yet you provoke it. Words have weight here, Orion. You're a guest, not a judge. Orion felt his anger simmering, not reduced. But he kept his mouth shut, casting his gaze down and silently nodding in false agreement. He liked Kenan enough to avoid escalating things further. At least, for now. He had his own way of escalating this. Sucking in air, Kenan exhaled slowly as he straightened his posture. Snapping his hands together with a sharp crackle of static electricity, his tone shifts to a more upbeat tone, breaking the silence. Now, Kenan said with a smirk, gesturing at their hands. Who's gonna be the bigger person here? / months later, 1 full year after Orion's disappearance from Piltover / Rays of moonlight danced through the foliage where Faye and Orion approached. It was an eerie sight at night, definitely lifeless. A wide circular dead zone where no plants or trees grew, just barren, dry soil. Yet, around it, the vibrant bioluminescent flora thrived, casting a surreal glow. Orion's gaze drifted out to the distant lagoon, where shimmering purple light reflected off the water from the flory lanterns. He'd grown fond of this place, despite the conflicts with Mayam and a few others who disliked his presence. Faye hobbled her way into the dead zone of spirits and nature, glancing back hesitantly at Orion. Are you sure you're ready? Of course. Orion nodded while smiling gently. I did say I would help. Despite her rocky relationship with Akali, Orion couldn't bring himself to hate Faye. Their shared pain made him want to at least try to mend her wound, and Akali's fractured bond with her mother wasn't really her fault. As Faye unwrapped the cloth around her severed leg, just below the knee, Orion knelt beside her and asked softly, Are you sure you want to go through with this? Mayam hasn't found a way, nor has Kenan and the others, Faye whispered dejectedly. I've spent my whole life trying to keep the balance, but I want to be selfish for once. I want to walk and run freely again, without being a burden anymore. Her gaze held fierce determination as she locked eyes with Orion. It was the look of a girl who wanted her life back no matter the cost. Orion nodded grimly, well aware of what may happen and the limited time he had to finish the process before one of the 3 King Cow Masters arrived. Placing a hand on her knee, he raised the other above where her missing leg would be when Faye suddenly grabbed his arm. She was breathing heavily, eyes wide with fear. Please. Don't fail. A single nod. That was all Orion could offer for comfort. He had no words for this because he too was scared to fail. Orion chuckled softly, voice trembling. Ah. I suppose I should say goodbye. What? A brilliant green light erupted from his hands, blinding Faye and forcing her to shield her eyes. Tendrils of green energy spiraled out from his arms, stretching out to the forest beyond. Her horror mounted as she watched the tendrils make contact with the nearby trees and plants, their vibrant colors draining into lifeless gray. Bark blackened, leaves withered, and flowers wilted in an instant. Faye's breathing turned frantic. She tried desperately to free herself, eyes squeezed tight as she struggled to push Orion off and shake loose. Orion, stop. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. You're killing, stop. Faye screamed, punching at his shoulder but to no avail. When it was over, Faye was left in tears. She sobbed uncontrollably as the weight of his actions, her request, settled on her. Slowly, her eyes opened, wide with shock and dismay. Her breath hitched as she looked down, seeing her leg restored, whole and unblemished. Her fingers brushed against it, the once missing limb starting to twitch and return to life again. Yet the sight and feeling brought no joy, only heartache. Why? Faye choked out, tears streaming freely down her face as she stared into Orion's cold, distant gaze. You knew. You knew what this would do, why? This goes against everything we stand for. Chapter 55, Consequences. Orion was turning to leave when a faint whistling sound echoed around them. Faye's tears slowed, her gaze shifted with confusion before her eyes widened. The whistling grew louder, morphing into faint, hollow screams that rose from the earth beneath them. Orion whipped his head around, a sinking realization gripping him. He truly messed up this time. A grey mist began to rise from the earth, swirling unnaturally and eerily, painting the once serene landscape with an ominous haze. During his training with Master Shen, he realized that this place was saturated with magic. Every life form, from the tallest trees to the tiniest squirrels that scurried about, was connected to it. Through vigorous training and meditation, he refined his control. Eventually, he could sense the magic around him, glimpsing the threads of energy weaving around him. Walking idly through a forest or along a road, however, he couldn't sense anything. It had yet to become second nature. He needed to focus to see magic. But this, he hadn't meant for this to happen. Orion never believed in superstitions. Why would cutting down trees for shelter or hunting animals for food cause nature to spiral out of control? Survival requires sacrifice. Sure, if someone went around destroying life for no reason, or hunting for sport, he could understand nature's retaliation. But this? Even now, Orion justified his actions. Using nature's magic to heal a person, wasn't that restoring life with life? Humans were as much a part of nature as the trees. Clearly, he was wrong. And now he saw the consequences. The mist swirled, twisting into shapeless forms before gradually solidifying. Some became humanoids. Their enraged, featureless faces glared with silent fury. Another took the shape of a wild boar, though it had a far more solid appearance than the rest, tusks glistening under the moonlight. Among the mist, twisted trees creaked to life, bark peeling back like an open ribcage. More corrupted beings continued to rise, each more disturbing than the last. Shadow spirits, Faye exhaled sharply, hopelessness gripping her as her gaze swept through the horde. And so many. There's a greater shadow spirit too. She gestured toward the boar, its defined and material features clearly more prominent than the rest. Her gaze returned to Orion, whose cold gaze transformed into something more solemn. Sighing in defeat, he muttered loud enough for Faye to hear, "Well, looks like I fucked up again. What did you expect? What are you doing?" Faye started to shout, anger flaring in her voice, but it shifted to worry as he knelt down, both hands pressed against the dirt. "Stop! Whatever you're about to do, stop it!" She clawed at the ground, trying to get closer to prevent him in some way. Ignoring her plea, Orion knelt and focused on the earth beneath him. He could see it fractures in nature's thread. Splintered strands shooting out like frayed cotton or sharp, jagged wires, giving birth to the shadow spirits now circling them. A faint, grey mist drifted from each spirit, trailing straight toward him like an accusation. Ah, just as they said. They seek vengeance or balance. Orion grimly thought, fully acknowledging both the King Cow Order's teachings and his failure and arrogance. The shadow spirits loomed between the wilted trees, lingering at the edges of the dead zone. Crossing the invisible line separating life from this zone, piercing shrieks echoed out as they approached. Panicking, Faye clawed at his shoulders, eyes wide with terror. "Orion! We need to get out of here." Orion's body began glowing a pale green, his arms trembling violently, and Faye instinctively retracted her hands in alarm. "No! Don't do something stupid again!" she pleaded, her hands poised to shove him back. But as she stared closer, her voice trailed off in shock. Through Orion's shaking, his skin paled and frame was thinning. Faye, stunned, watched as his health visibly deteriorated right before her eyes. Just like before, Orion's figure had withered into a skeletal husk. Faye could see his ribs protruding, hollow face, sunken eyes, and raspy breaths as he struggled. For Orion, the concept was the same as before, but instead of using nature, he channeled his own vitality, forcing it back into the wounded earth. Life returned, but not as it should have. The shadow spirits stopped. Watching. Waiting. Suddenly, vines erupted from the dead soil around Orion, twisting and curling toward the forest beyond. Petals unfurled, trees began to pulse as color returned, and vibrant life sprang back to life too quickly, too perfectly. Flowers blossomed unnaturally, growing in overabundance and twisting into new, unnatural shapes. Bursts of radiant light illuminated the undergrowth. The balance was no longer restored but exaggerated, forcibly bent back into an ideal shape that felt wrong. Faye's gaze darted between the shadow spirits dissolving into the earth one by one along with the mist. It worked. Faye thought, bewildered. But, how? Her voice cracked as she spoke to Orion, joyful but worried. "Orion, that's enough. You did it, it's over." A pulse of violet light suddenly radiated outward along the vines and soil into the forest, an electric hum filling the air. "What am I seeing?" Faye thought uneasily as twisting violet threads rippled and curled around them, bathing the forest in a soft, eerie purple glow. "Get away from him!" A worried voice cried out in the distance. Shit no! Orion shouted as ground crackled beneath him. A final, deafening pulse hummed outward before the energy collapsed inward on itself. The energy whiplashed back toward Orion, ending in a brilliant flash of violet light and a shockwave outward. Faye was sent flying back several meters, landing square on her back with the air knocked from her lungs and her vision consumed by searing violet light. Coughing, she spat some blood into the grass, struggling to focus as the blinding light began to dim. Silence gripped the forest. No shadow spirits, no haunting screams. The grey, lifeless dead zone and the forest pulsed with fresh life, plants and trees restored. But Orion was nowhere to be seen. Faye! A worried voice cried out. Akali and Mayam rushed the now thriving groove and embraced her, their eyes wide with concern as they fell to their knees beside her. Akali was the first to wrap her arms around Faye, followed quickly by Mayam. Both clung to her tightly, shedding quiet tears. Faye couldn't find words. Only pain physically and mentally as she clutched them back, trembling. Tears spilled forth as guilt gnawed at her chest. She had gotten what she wanted. But at a cost. In the background, Kenan curiously asked, "Isn't this where he first appeared?" Orion's form was violent, flung through space, the same wild magic that had transported him to Ionia radiated around him. But this time, it was different. Instead of being pure white with faint distortions along the edges, it was entirely violet. Deep, sickly violet, twisting and curling unnaturally around him. Unsettled and unnerved, fear clung to Orion as he had no control, no sense of where he was being thrown. Ack! Orion crashed into the ground, shouting in pain. Compared to his arrival in Ionia, he still had some strength, but his mind was rattled and disoriented. Gagging, Orion violently threw up as he crawled to his knees, breathing ragged and shallow. No fucking way! The familiar smell of rust and iron. A smog that burned his skin and eyes. Air so polluted that one unfamiliar would struggle to breathe. His eyes snapped open, and he was met with a disturbing, all too familiar sight. The warehouse where the gang battled Silco and the very place wild magic had torn him away from. Around him was a caved-in, perfect circle formed around his figure. The walls bore blackened scorch marks, and a thin layer of ash coated the every bit of pavement. Fucking! Really? Chapter 56, The Past and the Present. Quick address to Ionia, we can return in the future, it wasn't nuked. I mentioned before that it was only going to last a few chapters, I really didn't want to leave Piltover in the end just yet. It ended up being a good segment with lots of potential, but rushed by the end. Hopefully everyone enjoyed at least the taste of Ionia in this writing. For some, it will be disappointing because they enjoyed it a lot more. I was struggling to write it because I just wanted to return. I gave it my best effort, but it was still rushed because of my desire. On the positive side, we have affected Ionia lore, so it will be easier to return and explore. We can even return again before Act 2 potentially, or touch this spirit realm I keep seeing and maybe involve Janna, though I'll need help here or in Discord with that maybe. I can also make some of them come to Piltover to hunt him down perhaps. I saw fun ideas too. Permanent magical passage to teleport in that spot, or perhaps Orion can use teleportation now. Does that space Orion experienced in the teleport mean something evil lurks there? There are plenty of Ionian elements that can be brought to Piltover. We affected some canon characters directly, Akali, Shen, Kenan, and 2 lore characters. I've spent literal hours researching Ionia, apparently I've only scratched the surface. That being said, let's start the discovery of new Piltover. // warning, darker depictions of trauma this chapter / 1 year after Orion's disappearance, Undercity side of Piltover River / Stumbling out from the ruined warehouse, Orion's legs shook as he struggled to stay upright. Nothing looked much different on the surface. Outside of the wreckage of the warehouse, there were no brighter colors or new symbols of hope dotting anything. Well-maintained buildings stood proudly on one side of the river, while rusted tin and decay lined his side. Where do I even go? Orion thought grimly, staring out at the polluted river, faint lights scattering rays of light across the dark river surface. The memory of bombs detonating around him surged back, making him flinch. Yeah, I don't even know who won after that fight. I'll take a peek at the last drop, at most. His gaze shifted down to his garments. Ionian clothing, while not uncommon in Piltover, a hub of trading, didn't suit his features. He didn't look Ionian, just wore their garb. Dark green tunic with king cow patterns, a brown sash, and golden trim, all marking him as part of the king cow order. Orion stared down at his tunic before letting out another sigh. I have to get rid of this too, or people could associate my actions with the king cow order. Then they'll really come after me if they aren't already. Even after a year of training, which focused more on control than combat, Orion doubted he could take Shen in a fight. That man had too much experience. Orion would just find himself in a coffin. While continuing to assess his situation, faint echoes of laughter erupted from a nearby alley. 3 emerged from the shadows, all sharing a similar, malnourished build close to Orion's, though the man in front carried a weapon. The leader was a typical thug from piled-over no shirt, brown jacket, baggy pants, and a mask resting on top of his head. I guess that wolf mask stands out, Orion thought, amused. Looks like it's modeled after Kindred. The others too looked more ridiculous. One wore a shirt with the diva of Zon, Scratch's guitar drawn on, while the other. Is that a pink microphone? Orion's eyebrows furrowed as he stared at the completely out-of-place color on his shirt. Is there some new craze in the Undercity while I've been gone? What's an Ionian doing out here all alone? The leader sneered, bouncing the blunt end of his machete on his shoulder. Doesn't look Ionian. One of his goons chuckled. The other taunted, not very smart either. Ah, shit. Here we go again. Strangely, he didn't feel threatened or bothered by them as they approached. Maybe because he was older? No. Their malnourished, feeble frames were pathetic compared to the trained students at the King Cow Temple. Hold on, shouldn't nature be giving more of a damn here? This place is so out of balance it's a joke. Orion fumed in silence, especially after what happened, forgetting about the street thugs until they were directly in front of him. Strip? The leader demanded, smirking. What? You're a fucking vegetable. I doubt you have anything worthwhile. Stree. Before the leader finished, Orion raised his palm, channeling magic into a focused burst. A bright blue explosion erupted against the man's chest, hurling him back several meters, his machete dropping with a noisy clatter. The other two hesitated, looking back toward their fallen leader stunned. Orion took a calm step forward. Without a word, he gripped the one with Scratch's symbol by the head and delivered a sharp gut punch infused with magic. The man folded instantly, body lifting from the ground before he collapsed in a crumpled heap. Orion's cold gaze shifted to the last one, the one with a pink symbol. The man dropped to his knees with tears welling up. Ah, you're going to start crying now. Orion scoffed, stepping toward him. Shrieking, the man decided it wasn't worth it, and scrambled to make a run. Orion exhaled, releasing the last remnant of his magic from the previous punch. That training paid off. Orion looked down at his knuckles, turning his wrist. The control felt better, less fatigue, but it still burned. Less effort, but I'm not there yet. The thug wheezing on the ground received a sharp kick to the temple, knocking him out cold. They would be so mad at me. Orion let out an amused chuckle as he ripped off the thug's black scratch shirt and brown pants, replacing the Ionian tunic he previously wore. I look. Orion grimaced in disapproval, glancing over at the leader he knocked meters away. Jacket. Yeah, he took his brown leather jacket. Orion really missed his old one, it had more pockets, but this would do. Orion held the black wolf mask in his hand. Its design was curved and made of metal, the black wolf attached to it covering part of his natural brown hair when he tried it on. It's a bit much, Orion frowned. But it'll do. No telling who's friend or foe yet. How do I sound? Orion tested his voice behind it. The words came out slightly muffled, distorted. Not ideal. The vision wasn't the greatest either, limited, easy to be blindsided. Did Silco win? Did Shimmer take over? Or did things truly change? Orion's vision flashed to the two pairs of haunted eyes hovering in the warehouse window just before the explosion. Whatever, he groaned, shoving the memory back as deep as possible. Patting the thug's pockets, he found 2 silver coins, probably money for the 3 of them to eat. Rolling them in his hand, he sighed, and with reluctant pity shoved one back in the leader's pocket. He then grabbed his Ionian clothes, unsteadily walked toward the river's edge, and tossed them in before disappearing into the streets of the Undercity. Should I reconnect if they're doing all right? Orion questioned his involvement with Vander and the gang again. It doesn't seem to turn out well for me. // Powder's perspective // Get out of my face, sleazeball. Powder watched as her sister, 6, viciously shoved a bald drunkard out into the streets from the last drop. Powder had turned 13 recently. 6 was 16. It had been a full year since the explosion at Riverside. Vander stepped outside, drawn to the commotion this drunkard had caused. He had changed so much since then. More violent. More prone to snapping. The man tensed immediately, muttering, "I'm sorry," before meekly stumbling away. Many nights, Powder caught Vander pouring copious amounts of liquor into a cup alone, staring out into an empty bar. Sometimes, she noticed him glancing sideways, as if expecting someone familiar to sit beside him and lift his spirits. But the bar remained empty, and his face would harden with disheartened silence. After the incident, Vander told them everything. About Silco. He warned them never to approach anyone connected with Silco's influence. He told them about Orion's involvement, and how Vander tried to stop Silco from corrupting him, which led to all of this. Since then, a silent war raged in the Undercity. Vander would return home many nights with blood-stained gauntlets and fury etched into his face. Powder didn't understand the full extent of it, only that had everything to do with Silco. And every month, Vander would take Echo to the cemetery to mourn Benzo. Powder and the gang would tag along, equally sharing in the loss. Even now, none of them could visit without shedding tears. But what haunted Powder the most was Orion. "I'm sorry." Powder watched as Vander knelt at his grave, his face hollowed with guilt. "I killed your family, and I killed you. And I lost the lives of so many." Flashes of the memory seared Powder's mind, sending her into fits, ripping at her hair, flinching, or shouting randomly. Images of his desperate face, begging face before it all went silent, like her broken monkey toy. And now, as the drunkard staggered away from the last drop, Powder saw it again. The man's figure blurred in her mind, replaced by Orion's retreating figure. A sharp, pained whimper escaped her lips. She shrieked, startling Six and Vander as they both turned, alarmed. "Hey, Pow Pow, let's have some juice together, yet." Six's voice softened, her face twisting with concern as she reached out gently. For Powder, however, it was too much. Without thinking, she shoved Six's hand away, breath hitching. Breathing heavily, she looked up at them both, seeing the hurt and confusion in their eyes. Tears welled up as she clutched her arm, whispering, "Sorry." Her gaze flickered to the side, unable to meet theirs. Blink, blink. Powder paused, her gaze stuck on an alleyway, her emotions freezing for just a moment. An unfamiliar wolf-masked person, clad in a worn brown jacket, black scratched shirt, and brown pants. Something felt familiar, gnawing at her consciousness. She couldn't quite place it. "Pow Pow." Six's voice cut through the haze, causing Powder to blink. She quickly looked back at Six as if waking from a trance. Six looked concerned, reaching out with both hands, gently cupping Powder's face. Powder blinked again, swallowing as she nodded, but her eyes drifted back toward the alley. The figure was gone. Shaking her head, Powder clung tightly to her sister before they retreated back inside, sinking into her sister's comforting embrace. "That's a good girl," Vander's deep voice rumbled as he smiled warmly, ruffling her longer hair with his oversized hand. "I think I'll make something special tonight. What do you say, I?" Chapter 57, Breathing Room. Deep breaths, Orion thought, inhaling slowly. His mind drifted to Powder and the gang, a small smile forming despite himself. He was happy everything worked out for them. When observing from a distance, Powder seemed troubled, her body language screaming something was wrong, but he couldn't hear the details. He couldn't understand why though. Compared to Arcane, Powder had 6. She had Clagger, Milo, Echo, even Vander. "I don't know what more I could do for her," Orion grimaced, stomach growling. "I can't think like this. I need some food." After Orion sank back into the shadows from the last drop, he wandered the streets, seeking food. While weaving through the stalls, keeping a firm grip on the silver tucked in his jacket, wary of pickpockets, he noticed purple hues blending with neon green between buildings. "Shimmer," Orion observed cautiously. So it continued to spread. "This is the good stuff," a deep, gravelly voice said. A large, heavily augmented man chuckled obnoxiously from nearby, drawing his attention. His frame was massive with oversized arms replaced by clunky Chemtech augments. Metal plating covered both his chest and back, with glowing tubes of Chemtech fluid running along into his cannons, mounted under each arm. Despite these monstrous modifications, his face was well groomed with slicked back green hair and a curly mustache, a sharp contrast to his battle-modified figure. This man was in his 20s at least, maybe mid-20s? And he had to have money to afford it. Sitting at a food stall, puffing a pipe releasing purple vapor, the man exhaled a toxic-scented cloud with a deep grin. "I just can't get enough," the man said, his teeth yellow and crooked. He tilted his pipe toward Orion, who had taken a seat next to him with an overly friendly gesture. Puff. Orion's gaze flickered from the shimmering purple haze back to the creature's unsettling smirk. "What is it?" Orion asked cautiously. "What do you think?" "Shimmer-infused tobacco." "Everyone knows here." The man paused, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're not from the Undercity, are you?" "I am," Orion replied, hesitating before mixing in fragmented truths. "I was sent away. Locked up for a time." The man snorted. "Pfft, nobody talked to you rotating in? Must have been a swell guy." "Prison made me a bit crazy," Orion shrugged before tilting his head. "What happened while I was away?" "Boy, you really don't know." The man chuckled with an incredulous expression before his attention shifted toward a steaming bowl of food slid toward him. "How long?" "A few months." "A year." "A year." Surprised, he took his first slurp from the bowl, food spraying, before speaking with irritation creeping into his voice. "Well, a year ago riots broke out. Enforcers kicked open the hound's den, hurt his pups. Vander led another revolt." Orion's eyes widened, attentively listening. Letting out a mocking chuckle and spat, "Ha! But just like last time, he fucking gave it up. Rumor says he even sacrificed one of his kids too." The man slammed the counter, food staining his mustache, and anger replacing irritation as his gaze snapped to Orion. Vander shouldn't have bared his fangs if he wasn't gonna use them. Orion fell silent behind the mask, absorbing the words as they were spoken. A soft poke to his forearm drew his attention to the stall owner, staring impatiently at him and reminding him where he was. "Ah, sorry. One rat stew please." Orion slid his only silver coin across the counter when a low, dangerous growl emitted next to him. "You're not with the hound, are you?" Stiffening, Orion shifted his gaze back and saw that the man's gaze had shifted to suspicious hostility. The man's upper lip twitched, bearing a yellowed fang, and his metal claws curled as he gripped his bowl tighter. "I'm not with anyone. I told you. I just got out." Orion scowled, his expression tightening behind the mask. The man couldn't see his expression though, only his tension. "Yet? Or maybe you were one of his followers before thrown in jail like a retard." "You said a year? Matches the time of the riots." Orion shook his head. "No, I worked under Silco before I got caught." The man's entire demeanor shifted, his eyes widening as he leaned closer, voice dropping into a furious whisper. "Oi! Don't say that name here." The man hissed. "Things changed. Keep your voice down." "What? What happened to me being Vander's?" "Both names will get you killed technically." "Vander, he's changed." Leaning in, the man grabbed Orion and pulled him closer, whispering furiously, "I believe you. Just shut your mouth, all right." Grunting, Orion felt the metallic fingers tearing his skin. It wasn't intentional, it just lacked the fine motor control similar to most augmented limbs. Growling, Orion pulsed magic into his arm, dislodging the grip with a sharp spark of energy. "Whose side are you on then?" The man, who prided himself on his augmented arms, looked somewhat shocked. His gaze fell to his three-fingered metal hand with confusion, shaking his head as if it were just a strange accident. Scowling, he proudly announces with a smirk, "My name is Zarkan Poindexter. Successor of the Poindexter Kembaran family. We side with no one. Our family will rise above all others." Orion remained unimpressed, earning a disappointed side-eye from Zarkan. "I'm Ori Nightlight. Just a rogue resident, I guess." Clink. The cook finally slid Orion's stew forward, the scent making his stomach twist with hunger. He lifted his mask slightly, prepared to dig in when Zarkan sneered. "Snot-nosed urchin." Creak, hiss. A wave of fresh air washed over Orion as he stepped inside a breather station. Multiple stations, called breather stations, were scattered through the entresol and sump levels, providing clean air to the residents. Just like the cultivar, or the facto Rywood Garden C owned, these were places of respite during the arduous city life. And if you stayed too long, an enforcer would kick you out. The pipes hissed as fresh air leaked out. People from all around sat close to them, greedy or desperate, trying to take it in. Normal residents, sickly individuals, even Zarkan hovered for fresh air, or so it seemed. Breathing deeply through the mask, Orion needed this too. After so much time in Ionia, he had gotten used to clean air. This chemical bath he was swimming in scratched away at the sanity restored in Ionia. Maybe I should go looking around topside after this, at least I can breathe there. Then a question popped up in his mind, and his gaze searched the room. Excuse me, Orion asked one of the workers who stepped in, where does this air come from? The worker paused for a moment, agitated that he was forced to stop at all. Depends. Some are purified through alchemical filtration, but it's high maintenance and very unreliable. There are talks of this new Hextech air recycler. I'll believe it when I see it. This one, however, draws on a deep core vent. The man stopped explaining the technicalities suddenly when a shadow loomed over them. It's our property, Zarkan interrupted with a smirk. His enormous figure towered over them both, his metallic arms grinding noisily as he crossed them. Speaking of, where's the analysis? Bowing his head, the man sweated nervously. You will have it soon, but if I must walk down in these filthy streets one more time because of you, Zarkan steps forward, grabbing the man by the throat and lifting him into the air in front of everyone. No one, not even the enforcer, budged or looked willing to help. They only watched. Then prayers to Jana will be your only salvation. Chapter 57.5, Problems with Ventilation, Short. The technician dropped to the ground, gasping for air while clutching his neck. His eyes were wide, pupils shaking with raw terror. Never before had he come so close to death. Orion, who'd been observing from the sidelines, turned his head and felt unease entering his chest. It was strange, he didn't know how to explain it. People normally wouldn't involve themselves in other people's business, even when violence erupted. But here, nothing happened. Not a whisper of protest, nor a squeal for help. Just eerie silence. It was as if all compassion in the room had left. Maybe it was his time in Ionia, the calm temples of empathy and understanding, but a bitter pit twisted in his stomach. It was so cold and heartless, not even a glance of concern in the technician's direction. The air was apparently too precious, too valuable to waste on sympathy. I've changed a little, Orion thought bitterly as his gaze fell back to the shadowed technician. I wouldn't have cared as much before, would I? He exhaled sharply, then broke the silence. Do you need help? Orion's gentle voice cut through the tension. He was doubtful if he could help, but wanted to make the offer at least. Zarkan's cold gaze snapped toward him, cold and mocking, while he sneered before shifting back to the technician. I don't know what you could help with, the technician stammered, eyes darting between them. We don't know what's causing it exactly. Ah, shit. Orion resisted the urge to facepalm. What do you mean you don't know? Zarkan bellow shook the air as his enraged glare focused. His massive cybernetic frame hissed as steam vented from his augments, the pressure building as his fists clenched. The technician recoiled in panic and fear. I don't know. The readings don't indicate surface leaks, it's deeper, lower down in the mines. That's impossible, Zarkan spat, taking a step closer to the technician. Those vents are naturally occurring. Why yes, but they can still be damaged. A partial cave-in, maybe, or someone siphoning air. Stealing it. Zarkan froze, his expression tightened. Clearly, the thoughts he was having were not easing his restrained fury. You're suggesting someone dares to steal from the Poindexter Cambarans? His voice was low, a dangerous whisper that felt louder than a shout. The technician nodded weakly. It's just a theory, but yes, it's possible. A violent burst of steam venting from Zarkan's augments occurred before, without warning, he drove his metallic fist into the nearby wall with a deafening bang, leaving a deep imprint. The reaction was instant. A catalyst that finally sparked a reaction. Startled cries rippled through the station, with hushed gasps and sharp shrieks that broke the otherwise eerie silence surrounding them. Even the enforcer, who watched coldly before, shifted. His finger slid closer to the trigger, but still, he didn't act. Zarkan's breaths came slow and heavy as he tried to calm himself. When his steaming figure rose, the tubes along his augments violently shimmered before settling, his glare resting on the technician. It seems like you'll be taking a little trip down to the mines, won't you? Zarkan growled, spittle flying from his mouth and dribbling down his chin. Then, with a sharp glance sideways, his lips curled back into a sneer. And you'll have help. Chapter 58, Deep Core Vent. You shouldn't have said anything, lad, the technician muttered as they approached the mine's entrance, the damp air clinging to their skin. His gaze studied the pipe as they approached, creating a clear path and destination for them to follow. Orion didn't respond. He was wondering the same thing. Isn't this how I keep getting hurt? The silence lingered until the technician spoke again, more patient this time. What's your name? The technician persisted. Nightlight, and yours? Kieran Claremont, the man replied, offering a faint, tired smile. Orion's eyebrow raised, turning his head slightly. The pale light faded as they descended into the gloom. Light was replaced by the dull hum of chemtech lighting and the soft bioluminescence of strange mushrooms lining the stone walls. A last name? Orion asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. You're a topsider then? Chuckling softly, Kieran shrugged, more resigned than amused. More or less. Lately, I find myself in the Undercity more often than I'd like, have to make ends meet like any other family. Glancing toward Kieran again, Orion studied his features more closely now. Brown hair streaked with grey, left eye replaced with a blue artificer's eye for fine crafting, and a grey shirt with brown overalls. The stains of oil and grime, and the tool belt around his waist, added that extra bit to make him appear more like an Undercity resident. I'm sure your wife and kids must be appreciative, Orion said with a forced upbeat tone. Do they know what you're dealing with? Kieran's weary eyes shifted, his gentle smile faltering as his gaze met Orion's. No. My wife left me, it's just me and my daughter. She shouldn't know either. Ah, I'm sorry. Don't be. Kieran's solemn gaze shifted toward him from the path, his tone tinged with old pain. When we first met, I told her I wanted to leave Piltover. Travel the world, explore new places, build something new. His voice dropped lower. But things changed. But, don't you two have a daughter? What about her? My wife wanted to pursue happiness. Kieran sighed with resignation, disappointment clear in his eyes as he exhaled at the question. Our daughter has a gift. Though she wouldn't see it that way. She thought it was another curse of this city like everything else here. A brief pause followed as Orion frowned, their iron-toed boots echoing against the stone pathway. The faint sound of water dripping grew louder as they continued their descent into the mine along the fissure. Sorry, I still don't get it. Why didn't you leave with her if you had the chance? You could have stayed a happy family traveling the world, finding a new place to settle that isn't so. Staying in Piltover seems foolish. Kieran cut in with a quiet chuckle, the faintest glint returning to his weary eyes. Maybe. But some songs can't be sung elsewhere. Leaving would have meant turning our backs on the people we've bonded with, the ones who needed us. Could you really leave everyone behind, knowing they might never find their way without you? Depends, Orion snorted. Does your scenario include the variables of being stabbed, blown up, and thrown in jail? Kieran huffed, the corner of his mouth twitching with a wry smile. No, fair point. But I'd say risk is a part of the melody. The notes, the lessons, that hurt the most, give and teach us the most. Otherwise, why keep coming back? With a wry smile of his own, though Kieran couldn't see it, only his blank, unimpressed stare fixated on him, Orion scoffed. Yeah, sure. Let's stab you a few times, then a few more, maybe toss in a few bombs for good measure, nearly kill you, and then we'll see if your opinion stays the same. Kieran sighed wearily, closing his eyes briefly as they walked. It was the look of an old man who felt like he wasn't getting through to the younger generation. Orion had seen it plenty at this point. Just seeing it grated on him, but not to the point of outburst as they walked. Orion didn't disagree with Kieran. He was just frustrated. It felt like there was a large disconnect between their experiences, the same one that already existed between Topside and the Undercity. Ah, perhaps our source, Kieran said, his weary voice lightening as they continued forward. The change in tone drew Orion's attention back to the front. Large boulders and smaller rocks had collapsed inward from one side of the tunnel, not entirely obstructing the passage as it dripped murky water into a discolored pool below. Shifting his gaze upward, Orion traced the damaged support struts for the pipe knocked loose, a jagged rock embedded into the pipe. A sharp, high-pitched whistle filled the air as clean air escaped. That explains why we've been able to talk so easily. Kieran mused, stepping forward to inspect the damage more closely. Eyes narrowing, his eyes shifted back to the cave-in and murky water. But it doesn't explain the cause. Beckoning Orion, Kieran's expression tightened with concern as he carefully climbed through the jagged, 45-degree opening. The facility is just ahead, he called back, voice tense, as his leather gloves knocked some smaller rocks loose. Unease gripped Orion, a bad feeling rippling through him as he gritted his teeth and followed after Kieran. As they climbed through the narrowing gap, the pale light behind them faded as it was replaced by a glowing light orange ahead. The heat rose sharply. Subtle at first, then rising with each step. Breathing heavily, Orion emerged alongside Kieran, equally winded with his older age. His brows were creased and furrowed, his facial expressions shifting between confusion, concern, and quiet worry. Massive steam turbines roared before them, bellowing a brilliant orange light from within, illuminating the vast open expanse. On the far side, a minecart rested beside rusted rails that trailed into a deeper shaft. A network of pipes coiled from the tunnel's entrance, snaking toward the machinery along the ceiling. At the center of the expanse was a massive metal tanker, a thick pipe connecting it to a smaller one. The pipe radiated with brilliant light blue and green colors as, from a T-junction, alchemical fluids were fed into it from nearby alchemical vats. From the smaller tank, 3 pipes branched out in different directions, one of which trailed toward their entrance. Despite all of the heat and noise, everything seems to be functioning. Kieran whispered, fists clenching tightly. Orion's gut twisted harder. He knew it, something was wrong. But where is everyone?
Thanks for listening.